Listen and let a long river of storytelling unfold, beginning where memory and myth entwine. The Mahabharata did not appear fully formed on a page. It grew like a living tree, ring by ring, in the mouths of storytellers and the minds of audiences. To understand its origins, we must step back from the finished epic and follow the quiet, patient work of composition that spans centuries and cultures. Only then can the shape of the text, its layers and voices, begin to make sense to a modern ear. If you don't subscribe now, you'll miss your chance to join the living tree of voices that has grown for centuries. Will you be part of it or let it pass you by? Long before the Great War tore the plains of Kurukshetra, before chariots rattled and celestial weapons hissed through smoky air, there was a slow, human unfolding, the rise of a house, a dynasty named Kuru. The story begins not with a battlefield but with rivers and forests, with marriages and promises, with kings who sought to carve order from the chaos of clans. In that world, reputation mattered like the weather, and an insult could become a feud that lasted generations. To understand the Mahabharata is to follow how small choices and solemn vows braided themselves into inevitabilities, how the seeds of conflict were planted in gardens of honor and duty. The earliest roots trace back to Bharata, a legendary king whose name would one day define an entire subcontinent by the title Bharat. He was celebrated for conquest and law, and his descendants were thought of as exemplars of kingship. Over generations, his line produced rulers and sages, victories and follies, and a sense of destiny. Among these offshoots rose the Kuru line, centered on a river plain that promised fertility and trade, a place where a dynasty might anchor itself for centuries. A dynasty is not simply blood, it is narrative made manifest, and the Kurus were a tapestry woven from many threads, marriages that bound clans, advisors who whispered counsel, and sages whose curses and blessings could redirect the courses of lives. The early Kurus consolidated power by inviting talented men to their courts, offering land to loyal chieftains, and building assemblies where nobles could meet. They were keen students of the old forms of governance, yet practical enough to adapt. Where a ritual demanded a sacrifice, they would perform it. Where a neighbor turned hostile, they would meet force with diplomacy. At the heart of the Kuru story stands a handful of decisive figures. King Shantanu, with his regal stride and restless heart, is the first figure whose choices ripple outward in tragic clarity. He loved the river and the hunt, and he loved children less than he loved stories of lineage and legacy, but his passions led him into a marriage that changed everything. The story of Shantanu and Satyavati, and the extraordinary oath taken by their son Bhima, is a turning point that set strictures and wounds into the dynasty's body. Satyavati's arrival was a story of rivers and salt, of a fisherman's daughter whose scent and presence were said to bring both fragrance and fortune to a royal house. Shantanu loved her, but his eldest son opposed the match. It was then that Bhima, born Devavrata, assumed a vow so terrible and absolute that it haunts the epic. He renounced the throne and pledged celibacy to secure his father's happiness, binding himself to an ideal of duty that would outlive his personal needs but create a vacuum in the dynasty's succession. Bhima's vow was noble in intent and catastrophic in consequence. By removing himself from the line of succession, he made it inevitable that others, unready, unsuitable, or ambitious, would fill the throne and the court. His lifelong presence as a paragon of duty became also a rigid foundation on which the house could not bend. When winds of change threatened, Bhima held fast to precedent rather than innovation. That rigidity, paradoxically, would accelerate the house toward conflict, because every solution that required flexibility was barred by his purity of purpose. Satyavati bore sons for the house, and from those sons came a line of kings who were sometimes wise and sometimes foolish. The kingdom prospered and endured, but the question of who could rule remained fraught. Kings produced heirs through multiple wives, mistresses bore clandestine children, and the lines of descent became tangled. Royal polygamy and the custom of recognizing sons by rank and favor meant that cousins might look across a table and see not just kin but potential rivals. When the direct line faltered, the dynasty reached outward for heirs in ways that amplified latent tensions. Vichitravirya, a successor molded less by experience than by lineage, became king but died young and childless. The palace, full of ceremonial correctness, then faced a crisis. The continuity of the Kuru name was at stake. It was a crisis that demanded a creative, even desperate, solution, and it brought the house to the doors of the austere Bhishma, who had sworn to preserve the dynasty's dignity. It was in that fraught atmosphere that Vyasa, a sage of enigmatic origin, was called to sire descendants through the practice of Niyoga, where a man of wisdom would beget children on a widow to secure succession. The method itself reveals a social logic where duty to lineage could override personal discomfort. Pandu and Dhritarashtra were conceived in shadow and circumstance, the former pale of body and noble in spirit, the latter born blind but rich in presence. These two men, brothers in blood yet destined for divergent paths, would become the axis around which the later tragedy turns. Pandu's weakness was physical. He bore an illness or curse that made him unfit for the throne. His retreat to the forest with his wives Kunti and Madri created a household that would produce some of the most remarkable figures in the epic. Kunti, who had once been blessed with a secret prayer that could summon any deity to beget a son, used that boon to call forth sons who were divine in origin. Pandu's renunciation and Kunti's resourceful motherhood together produced the Pandavas, Yudhishthir, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sadeva, whose virtues and complexities would later animate the conflicts. Dhritarashtra, on the other hand, remained in the royal city, a king by blood but hampered by blindness and insecurity. His wife Gandhari, who famously blindfolded herself for life to share her husband's darkness, bore 100 sons, led by Duryodhana. The vast brood of Kauravas grew not simply in number but in expectation, sense of entitlement, and shared grievance. Gandhari's devotion and Dhritarashtra's ambivalence created a household in which love and jealousy were braided tightly together. In the palace of Hastinapura, education and apprenticeship formed another crucial strand. The princes were taught martial arts by Drona, a teacher whose own grievances and ambitions would feed the flame of rivalry. Drona was a craftsman of warriors, a strategist who valued skill above lineage, and he saw in Arjuna a pupil worthy of the highest praise. Drona's favor, however, was a double-edged sword. When a teacher elevates one student, others feel slighted, and in the court where every slight is measured in future advantage, the consequences are often deep and lasting. The youth of the Kurus was marked by tournaments and public feats, where prowess and grace determined prestige. Arjuna's mastery with the bow, Bhima's unbridled strength, Yudhishthir's steadfastness, and the twins' finesse all won admirers. Yet the same arena that fosters excellence also sharpens envy. Duryodhana saw not only their glory but also the threat it posed to his own claims. He watched as alliances formed and as loyalty shifted in subtle, irreversible ways. Marriage politics further entangled these bonds. The Pandavas' marriage to Draupadi, an event of destiny and controversy, introduced new currents of pride and humiliation into the court. Draupadi, won at a Swayamvara by Arjuna, would become both queen and a symbol of insult when publicly humiliated, and of dignity when her honor was defended. Duryodhana's plot to put her to shame in the gambling hall was not an isolated act of cruelty but the result of a long accumulation of resentment and bruised status. The custom of hospitality and feasting, of alliances sealed with gifts and brides, masked undercurrents of ambition. The establishment of Indraprastha, built by the Pandavas as a capital to accommodate their kingship away from Hastinapura, was itself proof that the kingdom could be split yet still flourish. To some it was an elegant compromise, to others, most notably Duryodhana, it was an insult, a reminder that the Kuru house had fragments that might align against the central power. The gleaming palace of Indraprastha, full of intellectual and artistic brilliance, became a symbol of what Duryodhana had been denied. Politics in the Kuru court was not only about battle prowess or lineage but about counsel and the moral language of Dharma. Vidura, the wise half-brother of the princes, was a voice of reason and ethical clarity who repeatedly warned against greed and malfeasance. His counsel, however, was often sidelined by passions and the intoxicating logic of power. The gulf between what was counsel and what was done illustrates how even clear ethical imperatives can be eroded by ambition and fear. Thus did a culture of personalization take hold. Decisions flowed less from institutionalized law than from the whims of powerful men and the sway of persuasive speech. The palace culture rewarded flattery and punished restraint, which made it fertile ground for schemers. Shakuni, Gandhari's brother, a man from Gandhara, played that role with cold cunning. His subtle manipulations in the game of dice would later become the point of no return, but long before the dice were cast his mind was at work sowing seeds of discord. Shakuni represented more than a single malicious actor. He embodied the external resentments and internal insecurities that a polity like the Kurus could incubate. He was mockable on the surface for his frail body and sharp tongue, but beneath lay a keen understanding of human failings. When he counseled Duryodhana, he offered not only tactics but also a moral map in which grievance often justified ruthless action. His interventions reminded the dynasty how quickly personal vendettas could be dressed as political necessity. The right of succession itself was murky, a mixture of custom, valor, and imperial sanction. In a world without fixed constitutional law, the question of who should sit on the throne woven with subjective judgments, the king's favorite, the most capable warrior, the eldest son, or the one with the most allies. Bhishma's earlier renunciation made the throne's vacancy more likely in moments of crisis, while Dhritarashtra's reluctance to act decisively allowed ambition to fester. These institutional weaknesses meant that every personal slight had the potential to magnify into a dynastic rupture. Embarrassment, then, should not be underestimated as a cause of conflict in the Kuru tale. To be humiliated in public was to be stripped of authority, and men for whom honor was the currency of life could not let that pass. The infamous dice game, where Yudhishthira was deceived and the Pandavas lost land, wealth, and finally their freedom, is an apotheosis of humiliation as a political weapon. It was a theatrical cruelty that turned private jealousy into public catastrophe. Before the dice were rolled, smaller fissures had been allowed to widen. The palace was full of whispered anxieties about succession, about the relative merits of different princes, about the influence of women and ministers. Alliances were chrome-plated by ceremony but rusted by suspicion. Counselors who sought to hold the middle ground were ignored or reviled by those who saw compromise as cowardice. In such an environment, a single manipulative act could send measured men spiraling into extremes. The episode of the dice has to be seen against this backdrop: Shakuni's cunning, Duryodhana's hurt ego, Dhritarashtra's conflicted indulgence, and Yudhishthira's problem with gambling and pride. The game itself was a spectacle, played with loaded dice that turned fortune into weaponry. As the stakes rose from cows and jewels to kingdoms and the very personhood of Draupadi, the line between private vice and public treason blurred beyond discernment. Draupadi's disrobing in the royal court is remembered not only for its immediate horror but because it crystallized the moral bankruptcy of a system that had tolerated smaller injustices. When a queen's honor could be gambled away, when witnesses stood by in horrified silence, it revealed how custom and power had conspired to degrade human dignity. The demand that she bow before others, or the attempt to do so, struck at something fundamental. A ruler's legitimacy depends as much on moral authority as on military might. The exile that followed was itself a furnace in which characters were tested and hardened. For 12 years the Pandavas wandered and learned. They gathered allies, studied under sages, and accumulated the skills and alliances that would later become decisive. It is tempting to view exile simply as suffering, but it also became a period of moral instruction, of trials that clarified who these men were. In the forests and courts of distant princes they learned diplomacy, ascetic discipline, and warcraft that later proved crucial in the theater of war. Even exile, however, could not entirely erase the patterns formed at home. In the background, Hastinapura continued to be a court that rehearsed old grievances. Duryodhana, installed by envy and aided by Shakuni's strategic genius, consolidated allies among regional kings. He framed the conflict as the defense of rightful inheritance, yet his methods often betrayed a hunger for unchecked domination. His creation of alliances by marriage and by force steadily altered the balance of power. The Kurukshetra conflict did not erupt from nowhere. It was the culmination of cumulative insults, broken norms, and rival visions of kingship. The Pandavas saw sovereignty as a responsibility bound by dharma and the welfare of subjects. Duryodhana, in contrast, saw kingship as restoration of what he believed was a rightful prestige, even if restoration meant trampling on opponents and rewriting rules. These competing philosophies found expression in military preparations and in the array of righteous arguments marshaled on both sides. The recruitment of allies widened the war from a dynastic feud to a pan-Indian contest. Great leaders, sages, and kings took sides based on friendship, obligation, or political calculation. Krishna, often invoked as a divine strategist, played the role of counselor and diplomat, embodying the complex moral calculus that the epic explores. His interventions were not simply to pursue victory but to bend outcomes toward cosmic purpose, to guide human ambition within the contours of a larger moral frame. Krishna's presence complicates the story in ways that deserve attention. He is both a statesman and a spiritual guide, a charioteer to Arjuna and an influencer of kings. Through Krishna, the narrative suggests that even the greatest human agency is subject to cosmic design and that moral clarity sometimes requires severe choices. Yet Krishna's choices also pose difficult ethical questions. When does counsel become manipulation, and when is strategic deceit permissible in pursuit of a greater good? The saga doesn't offer tidy answers. Instead, these ambiguities become part of the seeds of conflict. The role of teachers and mentors in the Kuru saga also bears scrutiny. Drona, with his complex biography, a Brahmin by birth who married into warrior household, who himself harbored resentments over land and recognition, shaped a generation of warriors. His attachment to his son Ashvatthama and his sense of injustice toward Eklavya, who sacrificed his thumb in tribute, reveal how personalized honor can distort pedagogical ethics. Teachers, meant to refine virtue, sometimes become actors whose private grievances have public consequences. So why did a single royal house produce such prolonged violence? The answer lies in the interplay of culture, psychology, and institution. The culture exalted honor and retribution in ways that made compromise appear as weakness. Psychologically, envy, wounded pride, and parental partiality created deep fissures that prudence struggled to fill. Institutionally, the dynasty lacked mechanisms to adjudicate disputes without resorting to brute force when leaders were unwilling to yield. Later authors and storytellers would frame the Mahabharata as a lesson in Dharma, in which right action must sometimes be chosen against treacherous currents. But the seeds of conflict are everyday human failures: a father's favoritism, a teacher's slight, a brother's jealousy, a prince's reckless wager. These human details are what make the epic resonate across millennia, for dynasties rise and fall not only because of great battles but because small acts collectively redirect history. To appreciate the Kuru dynasty's rise, one must also consider the wider social fabric. The Kurus existed within a mosaic of tribes and kingdoms, each with its own customs and claims. Diplomatic marriages extended influence but also imported rival claims. The mobility of warriors, the patronage of bards, the craft of charioteers, the loyalty of vassal kings, all these everyday elements sustained the dynasty and also made it vulnerable. When the center weakened, the periphery could either be swayed or turned hostile, and in a polity built on honor the slightest tilt could mean catastrophe. Religion and ritual oriented the Kurus toward legitimacy. Sacrifices, coronation rites, and observances of venerable laws were meant to sanctify rule and to bind the king to cosmic order. But ritual cannot substitute for genuine justice, and the mismatch between public piety and private wrongdoing widened distrust. Ritual purity without ethical action became a mask that permitted ambition to dress itself in sanctified garments, making it harder for critics to unmask the maleficence beneath. Even the physical geography played a role. The plains of the Ganges basin were abundant and therefore worth contesting. Rivers provided both sustenance and avenues for trade and movement of armies. Cities like Hastinapura and Indraprastha were nodes of power, but their proximity also made disputes immediate and unavoidable. When contested lands are valuable, grievances turn swift into warfare, because the temporal costs of yielding are severe for those who prize legacy above all. The Kuru story is also a saga of memory and narrative. Each generation told its tale of who was wronged and who was right, and these stories hardened into the narratives that guided future action. Grandmothers and ministers, soldiers and bards, all participated in shaping collective memory, deciding which grievances were to be honored and which were to be forgotten. Over time, these memories ossified into a moral landscape where compromise was seen as betrayal and vengeance as righteous correction. Consider, for instance, the role of parental love and its distortion. Dhritarashtra's protective bias toward his son Duryodhana blinds him to the ethical abyss that his favoritism fosters. He sees insults aimed at his son as slights against the house itself, and his failure to adjudicate fairly stems not from a lack of understanding but from a captured will. Gandhari's veiled life and loyalty are no less determinative. Her silence and influence create a moral backdrop in which grievances find a maternal legitimacy. The figure of Yudhishthira is central to understanding the seeds of conflict because he represents the tension at the heart of the dynasty, the conflict between adherence to duty and the flaws of flesh. He is righteous yet fallible, kingly but human. His gambling addiction is a fault that has enormous structural consequences because it permits enemies to convert a moment of private weakness into public catastrophe. His inability to see through the traps laid by Shakuni exposes how one person's failing can compromise a whole polity. Equally important is Bhima's rage and Arjuna's disappearing self-doubt. Bhima's appetite for justice is raw and physical, a force that will later be unleashed in war, while Arjuna's skill makes him both a strategic asset and a potential source of excessive valor that complicates political calculations. The twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, embody grace and humility but are often underappreciated. Together, the five Pandavas are not mere exemplars of righteousness, they are complex personalities whose virtues are entangled with shortcomings, making their path to kingship fraught. Conflict also grows from the multiplicity of loyalties that characterize a complex court. A warrior might owe allegiance to his teacher, his king, his clan, and himself. When these loyalties conflict, action becomes ambivalent, and vacillation can be fatal. The Kuru saga is filled with such dilemmas. Should a commander obey a king's immoral order to preserve stability, or refuse and invite immediate chaos? These ethical knots reveal why decision-making in such a world was so perilous. The seeds of conflict are further nourished by the idea of honor as compensation for loss. Duryodhana's sense of loss is not merely material but ontological. He feels that his rightful sense of being a prince has been stolen by his cousins. Material compensation cannot satisfy this existential grievance. Once honor becomes the metric by which self-worth is judged, restitution becomes difficult because it demands not only compensation but a reshaping of personal identity, a reshaping that is often refused. This is why war, when it finally arrives, feels inevitable yet excruciatingly personal. The Kurukshetra battlefield is not just a stage for grand tactics but a place where feuds, betrayals, and vows collide. Each commander carries memory and revenge into the fray. The weapons unleashed are both literal and symbolic, arrows and insults, curses and diplomatic breaches. They are the final currency of an escalatory logic that took root early in the dynasty's life. The counsel of wise men often failed not for lack of insight but because the moral imagination needed to solve the crisis was lacking. Practical solutions required giving up something fundamental, surrender of a claim, recognition of a rival, or an admission of fault, and human beings hate to concede their narratives of righteousness. Even when gurus and sages offered compromise, the parties most invested in grievance could not imagine being anything other than the aggrieved or the avenger. All these threads, vows and renunciations, teacherly favors, marital politics, the sting of humiliation, the limitations of rituals, and the absence of robust legal mechanisms, combined to make the Kuru dynasty an incubator for conflict. The story's genius is in showing how tragedy is not born of a single monstrous man but of many ordinary failures compounded over time. When a dynasty's moral soil is repeatedly tilled by ambition and fear, it becomes fertile soil for catastrophe. The narrative of Mahabharata thus invites reflection about how societies maintain order. It asks whether institutions can hold when personalities fail, and whether cultural ideals can be upheld when they are selectively invoked. The Kuru example demonstrates that a culture may possess impressive spiritual resources and yet be morally fragile because those resources are used instrumentally. When sanctity becomes a tool, the ethic itself degrades. There is also an element of generational disjunction in the story. Each generation inherits not only material wealth but grievances and expectations. The children are taught a version of the world that valorizes certain responses, honor, retaliation, and the sanctity of lineage. Yet the world offers no guarantee that such measures will lead to thriving communities. As young princes internalize these priorities, they reproduce the patterns that made conflict likelier in the first place. The interplay of fate and agency is a persistent theme. Many characters appeal to destiny or curses as explanations for their plight, while others act as if every choice is free and determinative. The Mahabharata resists a simple resolution. Fate shapes circumstances and offers constraints, but human choices, made in particular contexts and under specific pressures, also determine the outcome. This ambiguity is what makes the Kuru dynasty's rise and fall so poignantly instructive. In the decades before the Great War, we see how small grievances calcify into social policy. What begins as personal vendetta becomes a rationale for alliances and military campaigns. Noble ideals are reinterpreted to justify power grabs. The Kuru court's inability to establish durable systems of sedition resolution meant that private grudges were inevitably escalated into public actions. This transformation illustrates how personal psychology can morph into institutional inertia. The Kuru's experience teaches that leadership requires more than valor. It demands moral courage to act against one's own tribe when the tribe is wrong. The reluctance of Dhritarashtra to discipline his own son, Bhishma's rigid adherence to vows when flexibility might have spared many, and Yudhishthir's failure to avoid trap-laden gambling all point to the limits of conventional morality when confronted with political exigency. Leaders must not only be wise but adaptable, and the Kuru tragedy shows what happens when adaptability is absent. The role of women in the saga is complex and central. Figures like Satyavati, Kunti, Gandhari, and Draupadi are not mere props. They are agents whose choices and sufferings shape the course of events. Satyavati's marriage exchange set genealogical conditions. Kunti's invocation of divine sons rearranged power. Gandhari's restraint lent moral force to a cause. Draupadi's humiliation created moral impetus for revenge. The dynasty's narrative thus depends on the delicate interplay between male public action and female agency that is often expressed in less visible but equally consequential ways. The Kuru story also raises questions about the cost of purity and sacrifice. Bhishma's vow of celibacy and renunciation is presented as the highest form of duty, yet it produces an institutional brittleness. The lesson here is paradoxical. Moral exemplarity is necessary, yet, when enacted without worldly wisdom, can cause harm. A life lived for principle is noble, but when principle becomes an unbending barricade, it can prevent necessary adaptability and hence store up catastrophe. At an everyday level, the seeds of conflict reflect human tendencies: miscommunication, pride, partiality, and fear. In many scenes, the problem could have been solved by direct conversation or by impartial arbitration, but the social scripts encouraged performance over dialogue. The court preferred ritual and ceremony to honest reckoning, which meant that the grievances festered rather than healed. Such patterns remind us that conflict prevention is less dramatic but more demanding than victory in battle. As the story inexorably moves forward, the dynasty's accumulated errors make reconciliation difficult. Each failed compromise becomes evidence that soft measures do not work. Each act of harshness becomes precedent for further harshness. When both sides believe themselves justified by memory and metaphysics, negotiation becomes a theater of posturing. The ground for settlement vanishes under the weight of honor, history, and wounded pride. In tracing the rise of the Kuru dynasty and the seeds of its later conflict, we see a microcosm of how civilizations handle power and moral responsibility. The Mahabharata uses kings and warriors to dramatize questions that every polity must face: how to distribute power fairly, how to adjudicate grievances, and how to prevent the personalization of public institutions. The Kuru's failure in these respects was not simply a moral failure but a structural one, reflecting the absence of mechanisms to channel ambition into peaceful competition. One can also treat the saga as a meditation on human fallibility. The characters are richly drawn, never wholly virtuous nor wholly villainous. They embody contradictions. Their complexity is part of the tale's enduring power. We recognize ourselves in their virtues and their vices. The seeds of conflict thus are not foreign or demonic, they are familiar. We see them in our own institutions and families, and that is why the epic continues to teach and unsettle. Finally, the story of the Kuru dynasty reminds us that the making of history is an art of accumulation. One vow, one slight, one bad choice, compiled over generations, can produce destiny. Histories do not spring fully formed but are layered and sedimented. The Mahabharata invites listeners to pay attention to the small things, because in the slow turn of human affairs the small becomes the decisive, and the rise and fall of dynasties hinge on what people do in quiet rooms as much as on what happens on thunderous battlefields. The plain of Kurukshetra lay under a steel-blue morning sky, a carpet of dew and trampled grass that would soon be torn into furrows of war. Villages around the battlefield muffled their lives, as if listening for the first shout that would break the silence, and both camps arranged their banners and chariots with the practiced solemnity of people about to perform an ancient, terrible rite. This was not merely a clash of armies but the culmination of old grievances and claims, a contest where dharma and desire were woven so tightly that unpicking one thread threatened the fabric of the world. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, a living pause between history and fate. On one side stood the Kauravas, a vast array of warriors forged by pride and lineage, led by Duryodhana whose ambition had hardened like tempered iron. He had sworn to deny the Pandavas their coronation, and his council had brought every ruthless asset of Hastinapura to bear: mighty elephants, steeds bred for war, chariots built for speed, and countless foot soldiers who looked to war as the only language left to them. His generals were men and demons, heroes and mercenaries who believed in him or feared him, and they took their places as if upon a stage whose script they had long rehearsed. Across the field, the Pandavas gathered with a quieter, more troubled resolve, 5 brothers bound by fate and the righteousness they each understood in differing measures. At the heart of the Pandava camp stood Arjuna, bow in hand and thoughts turned inward, his mind like a lake in which storm clouds had gathered. Beside him was Krishna, who had renounced arms yet chosen the charioteer's rein to guide Arjuna through the moral thicket that would open with the first trumpet. The relationship between the warrior and his charioteer was intimate, intellectual, spiritual, tactical, and it would become the axis upon which many decisions turned. All around them were allies, the Brahmin-turned-warrior Yudhishthira, whose patience was both his strength and his burden, the fierce Nakula and Sahadeva, and the invincible Bhima, whose appetite for combat matched his appetite for food. War is always a mosaic of preparations and omens, and Kurukshetra was no exception. Priests performed rites, horses were anointed, and soldiers made offerings to gods whose faces were known and unknown. The air held the smoke of sacrificial fires, a scent meant to sanctify the forthcoming slaughter while also attempting to negotiate with forces beyond human comprehension. Yet rites cannot wholly contain the chaos of battle. They were a thin ceremonial skin over a muscle that tensed and would soon snap in violence. The opening day was a disciplined tension folded into a rush. Chariots streamed forward at dawn, trumpets wounded the air, and commanders called their contingents into position. Arms met with the sound of creaking leather and tuned strings. Men named their gods as they drew near to the enemy and formed alliances under flags and shafts of sunlight. Even the bees and the birds seemed to take notice, leaving the battlefield as if sensing that the earth itself would be marked by human hands. Bhishma, the grandsire of both houses, was the earliest force arrayed into action, and his presence alone set a tone of dread and respect. He was a man of ancient vows, with arrows that had story and ritual before they even found flesh, and his knowledge of warfare was encyclopedic. Yet he fought not to resolve grievances or to seize power, but to abide by duty, and this paradox made every arrow he loosed heavy with meaning. The Pandavas could not easily strike him down without also striking at the stubborn architecture of social order and obligation he represented. On the first day, Bhishma's arrows darkened the sky and the ground became a mosaic of fallen standards and bruised earth. The Kaurava formations, sprang from his strategy, became a living thing, rose folded and reformed under his direction like a great tide. Men who had thought themselves leaders found themselves following the rhythm of a man whose personal code had become the battlefield's metronome. When Arjuna met Bhishma, the encounter was less a duel and more a moral debate in motion, each arrow a sentence that argued a point, honor, lineage, the cost of fulfilled vows. Arjuna's skill was equal to his torment, and on that first day he shot like a man trying to stitch the world back together. His arrows found gaps and his voice found the air, but each victory against the Kaurava host felt incomplete while the grand old warrior still breathed. Krishna guided him with a balance of affection and strategic coldness, reminding Arjuna that the war would claim men and reputations regardless of his personal reluctance. This interplay of human hesitation and divine counsel would reverberate through the days like a refrain. The second day widened duties into tactics, and Drona brought his mastery to bear with the steadiness of a sculptor shaping chaos. A preceptor who had trained princes in arms, Drona knew every feint and countermove, and he arranged men into formations that tested the Pandavas' resolve. His students looked to him for glory, his enemies saw in him a force of inevitability. He was not the sentimental type, his goals were practical and, to him, necessary, and this made his interventions chillingly efficient. Drona's strategies introduced formations like the vulture and the wheel, each a mathematical arrangement of men and beasts designed to encircle and crush. The Chakravyuha, the ominous military wheel, was one such design, a spiral that challenged any who tried to breach its rings without knowing the way through. It was an aesthetic of war, cruel in its beauty, and those who understood its pattern could flow through it like a river. Those who failed found themselves broken on its teeth. The Pandavas would suffer for their incomplete knowledge of such tactics, and this suffering shaped their mourning and their anger in ways that would influence later decisions. The third day saw sparks that would kindle into tragedies, and Abhimanyu, son of Arjuna, moved across the field as if destiny had arranged him to be both spear and sacrament. He knew only part of the Chakravyuha's secret, taught by a tale told over a father's shoulder and cut short by sleep and silence. Because he knew only how to enter but not to exit, his bravery became a trap, heroism gripped by technique and the cruelty of numbers. When he found himself isolated in the heart of the wheel, encircled by the Kaurava best, the war revealed its most telling face. Valor bound by ignorance turned to catastrophe. Abhimanyu's death was not simply a loss of one warrior, it was the shattering of fatherhood, of promise, and of a more private code that said the young would survive the old. Arjuna's grief became a blade that no ritual could blunt, and the Pandavas' wrath shifted from restrained political maneuver to something sharper and more personal. The narrative of the war became even more jagged, and both camps understood that the rules had changed. What followed was a sequence of revenge-minded calculations and a loosening of the old restraints that had still, incompletely, restrained men. Bhima, who had always been a force of elemental appetite and rage, took to this new freedom with a dreadful relish. Each duel he engaged in was like a storm meeting an unready shore. He struck like thunder, consumed like a fire. When he hunted Duryodhana's allies, his blows were calculated not only to kill but to demonstrate the price of crossing moral boundaries. The smell of iron and dust seemed more indelible around him, and his laughter grew less like joy and more like a sound made by someone who had learned a bitter lesson and wanted everyone to hear it. Drona's son, Ashvatthama, brought his own fury to the field, and the young warrior's loyalty to Duryodhana became a mirror to the older loyalties that had begun this feud. He fought with a mix of personal ambition and wounded devotion, and his actions would later tie into the darker threads of the war's aftermath. The battlefield was not just a public square of power, it was a theater for private vendettas, for relationships that carried poison as much as they carried honor. Each combatant carried a story into the fray, loves, betrayals, teacher-student bonds, and those stories turned the clash into a human drama of immense cost. Dawn after dawn the pattern repeated, and the land itself began to suffer a physical exhaustion. Crops were crushed under hooves and the rivers ran brown with silt and sometimes with blood. Priests could still chant, but their words grew thinner, as if sound would not excel in a place where earth had been turned over so often. Children from nearby hamlets watched from afar and then disappeared, carried away by elders who understood that the battlefield was not a stage for learning but a maw. Karna, the tragic peerless archer who had been denied his birthright and kept the bitterness of that denial like a second skin, came to prominence as the days unfolded. His life had been a testament to the way circumstance can bruise nobility, and when he stood on the Kaurava side, his presence complicated every moral calculus. He was both villain and victim, a man who had known rejection and had then chosen loyalty to a brother who offered him a place. The poignancy of his story added a moral ambiguity to the battlefield. Killing him felt like slaying a wrong as much as it did like slaying a rival. Karna's armor and earrings, gifts from his mother that protected him like a divine cloak, became objects around which the battle's fate turned. They were more than practical protections, they were tokens of identity and destiny that marked him as unique. Later, when he surrendered these protections under complex circumstances, the ethical lines of warfare blurred further, because the exchange of a single act could change the balance of power and the course of men's lives. Such small choices multiplied into tragedies that would not be easily reconciled. Drona's death, a deliberated, contested event, was one of the great pivots of the war, and it was achieved through strategy, falsehood, and deep moral compromise. The Pandavas, guided by tactical necessity and a desire to remove an incorrigible foe, used a tactic that involved telling a partial truth painted as a victory. When the news of Drona's son's death reached him, Drona's adherence to duty fractured and he was killed amid a haze of moral ambiguity. His fall exposed how, in the calculus of war, means and ends sometimes swap places and leave everyone darker for it. The slaying of Drona intensified the fury of men like Ashvatthama, who saw in his father's death a wound that could not be closed by victory alone. His rage became a springboard for acts that belonged more to revenge than to the laws of combat, and his ensuing actions would haunt the survivors. War, here, had become a contagion. Each violent remedy invited a harsher symptom. The ethical scaffolding that had once held leaders accountable buckled under the strain, and the rules of engagement loosened with terrifying speed. The night after Drona's fall was not a rest but a fevered sorting of spoils and dreams. Men dreamed of their homes and of the last words their mothers had said, and their sleep was interrupted by the knowledge that morning might demand bloodier taxes. Tents became spaces for confessions, for the last exchanges between comrades, and for the writing of letters that might never be sent. The human need to speak, to reconcile, to name one's fears, continued even as the instruments of death were sharpened by the light of the fire. Karna returned to prominence as the war meandered toward its finality, his match with Arjuna a duel that had been promised and postponed for years. In their encounters there was the weight of personal histories, and neither could treat the other as a mere opponent. Every shot exchanged between them carried with it stories of slights and promises and the long arc of destiny that had placed them on opposite sides. Their final confrontations were less about victory and more about closure, each arrow a punctuation in a conversation that had started long before their births. The day when Karna fell was layered with irony and sorrow, and it arrived with the sort of cosmic timing that epics delight in. He was killed after his chariot wheel sank into the ground, a moment when a hero's humanity, a fear of being trapped, of being unfairly disadvantaged, was exposed. He begged for time to free his wheel, and in that moment his life was taken, a deed that some would call just and others would call cowardly. His death stirred debates among the victors about honor, about the acceptable face of victory, and the answer was never comfortable. As the corpses mounted like low ridges across the battlefield, both camps felt an increasing sense of hollow victory. The Pandavas were making progress toward their goal of reclaiming what they thought was rightfully theirs, but the price was written in the bodies that now lay cooling. Each slain warrior carried with him a set of relations, a mother, a lover, a teacher, whose lives would be realigned by absence. The joy of triumph was tempered by the knowledge that the land they sought to govern had been mutilated by human hands. The war spawned its own minor legends along the way, duels that became dialogues about courage, small acts of kindness that held against the tide, and brutal betrayals that altered families for generations. There were moments when warriors spared old foes, when enemies recognized each other's humanity and declined to deliver the final cut. There were moments when even the most hardened commanders paused to ask whether this was the only conceivable end to their quarrel. These moments were fragile and transient, like sunlight on a rippled pond. One of the most dreadful turns came during the night raids and the use of stealth and forbidden tactics. The laws of war that even the roughest tribal codes once abided by began to fray under the pressure of total victory. The fight moved, at times, from open field to cunning ambushes, and in those darker acts the war derived a moral stain that even the winners could not scrub away. The field of Kurukshetra became a theater where not only strength but cunning decided fate, and cunning often involved ignoring a morality that had once guided kings. Gatotkacha, the son of Bhima and a Rakshasa who could change size and shape, became a terrifying asset for the Pandavas, especially at night. His powers were suited to the darkness, and he used them with an artist's flair, creating terror among the Kaurava camp that could not be softened by bravado. Yet his end came by a weapon that could pierce the enchantment of such a creature, and when he fell he took with him some of the Kaurava's best hope of neutralizing nocturnal threats. His death removed a unique element from the Pandava arsenal and restored to the Kauravas a sense that the battlefield could still be wrested around unexpected events. As the fighting stretched, exhaustion crept into decision-making, and men who were heroes in the cool morning became brittle in the long evenings. Fatigue made people less moral and more dangerous, because tiredness narrows thought to the simplest drives: survival, revenge, the end of pain. Generals who would once have thought twice now made choices of swift cruelty, believing that delay only strengthened the enemy. The rhythm of battle thus changed from strategic choreography to a series of desperate, exhausted lunges. In the penultimate days, the Kaurava numbers dwindled, but their stubbornness hardened into a fearsome wall. They fought like men who had nothing left to lose because, in many cases, they truly had nothing. Duryodhana's resolve, which had appeared to be a kind of foolish pride, became a deadly resource that prolonged the war. He fell back on personal valor and the backing of men whose desperation made them as dangerous as any trained phalanx. The final showdown between Bhima and Duryodhana carried a personal history that now became public spectacle, and it was not a fight of policy but of things said and done across the years. Bhima remembered insults and injuries and carried the memory of loved ones killed, and Duryodhana held fast to a pride that had once seemed almost comic and now seemed tragically inevitable. The duel was less about the throne and more about settling who they had been to one another, and the outcome was as much about private satisfaction as about political resolution. Even as rulers fell and the battlefield cooled, the echoes of counsel and philosophy lingered. Yudhishthira, who had been raised for kingship and the law, found the crown a heavy and tarnished object. He had achieved what he had set out to do, yet the spark of satisfaction was small compared to the enormity of his losses. He sat with questions that had no immediate answers. Had he done right by Dharma? Had the slaughter been justified by victory? The silence that followed his coronation was a different kind of battlefield, one in which memory and conscience contested for possession of his peace. The immediate aftermath of the war turned Kurukshetra into a place of pilgrimage and lamentation. Survivors wandered among graves and broken standards, seeking faces they did not find in stories that would no longer be told. Mothers clutched scarves, sons wished for a return that had been deemed impossible, and those who had once been certain that violence brings order began to see the long, slow work that would be required to undo its damage. Reconstruction was not merely physical rebuilding but a labor of moral repair, and it would be complex and incomplete. Yet the world moves forward, and the new reign strove to pull itself into a semblance of normalcy. Laws were reissued, menus were set, and the machinery of state began to turn again. But those who had held power learned a difficult lesson: legitimacy does not erase grief, and authority founded on blood requires continuous tending. The kingdom had been won, but it would forever carry the stains of how it had been won, and those stains would inform the generations to come. Stories of the Kurukshetra war traveled far and wide, becoming both cautionary tales and heroic songs, and they lodged in the collective memory as complicated artifacts. Bards sang about valor and betrayed trusts, about fathers who must choose between their sons and their vows, and the public recited these verses with tears and cheers mixed together. The war thus transformed into legend, not a simple memorialization but an ongoing conversation about what it means to rule and what it costs to desire power. The character of Krishna, both divine counsel and worldly strategist, remained a focal point of debate long after the last spear had found its mark. His counsel had guided Arjuna through the paralysis of the battlefield and had helped shape the course of events, yet some questioned the ethical cost of his interventions. Was he a god acting for cosmic balance, or a cunning actor shaping fate for his own ends? These questions sustained philosophical inquiry and religious reflection for generations, making the war an endless mirror for the human need to understand divine action. The remaining seconds of the war story are full of ghosts, not literal specters that walk the field but memories that haunt families and cities. Nights were thick with them, the cries of the dying remembered in the sighs of those left behind, the scent of blood that clung to garments and to the minds of those who could not sleep. The war had opened fissures in people's souls, and those fissures needed time and care to heal. Some healed, some calcified into suspicion, and some remained raw, ready to be picked at by later crises. The epic sweep of Kurukshetra continued to inform law and art, for people sought to draw meaning from the wreckage. Poets and playwrights returned to the scenes, each finding different notes to amplify the tragedy of Abhimanyu, the complexity of Karna, the stubbornness of Duryodhana, the sorrow of Yudhishthira. These retellings did not simplify, they multiplied the questions. The battlefield became a text read and reread, and each reading revealed new moral corners and new human shadows. One of the enduring lessons was the way kinship can be weaponized, how family ties can be turned into stakes rather than bonds. The war had begun over succession and slight, but it escalated because people chose to treat interpersonal grievances as existential threats. People who could have negotiated lives together instead litigated blood, and the result was a general lesson about the fragility of trust. This lesson traveled with the story as an admonition: to valorize family is not the same as to weaponize it. The Mahabharata's great war at Kurukshetra is remembered for its titanic battles, but it is also a study in the small human choices that escalate conflicts beyond repair. Each insult unredeemed, each compromise refused, compounded into a disaster. Men who might otherwise have been neighbors became enemies through a chain of choices that, one by one, made peace impossible. The Great War thus stands as a caution about the cumulative cruelty of small decisions. Religious and philosophical traditions mined the war for teachings about duty, action, and non-attachment, and these lessons resonated because they addressed human behavior at multiple levels. The Bhagavad Gita, delivered within this context, turned a battlefield's paralysis into a metaphysical classroom, engaging with issues of duty and the self in crisis. It did not make the violence less violent, but it offered a framework for understanding action without ego, for performing duty while trying to reduce the poison of attachment. This spiritual teaching became one of the most lasting legacies to come from the soil of Kurukshetra. The war's end did not close the cycle of violence entirely, as the mental scars and enmities fed into future disputes and personal vendettas that would reach beyond the immediate generations. Ashvatthama's nocturnal revenge and the targeted violence that followed carried forward the tragedy in a new, quieter register, ensuring that the war's aftershocks would not cease with the last trumpet. These acts of vengeance reminded survivors that war has a way of seeding future wars in the same soil. Through centuries, storytellers adapted the Kurukshetra saga to new audiences and new moral climates, and with each retelling came shifts that emphasized different facets of the human predicament. Some told it as a parable of righteous war, others as a condemnation of kings who put pride over prudence. The multiplicity of interpretations is itself significant. It shows how a single catastrophic event can be woven into many moral fabrics, each emphasizing what its audience needs to hear. The story therefore operated as both history and morality play. Reading the Mahabharata in modern times, one sees not just a spectacular battle but a lesson in the complexity of human institutions. The war unfolded within a world of codes, kinship, kingship, guru-shishya relationships that are recognizable yet foreign in proportion. Examining these structures shows how social rules shape choices and how those choices can produce unintended consequences. Kurukshetra becomes a study in how institutions can fail their people when human frailty and ambition intersect. Don't just watch, subscribe immediately to join those who dare to question failing institutions, and comment the one code you would never betray. Scholars have long debated whether the war was inevitable, and that question remains provocative because it forces an examination of human agency. Were the tragedies fatalistic unfoldings of destiny, or could shrewd negotiation and greater humility have broken the cycle? The answer, like many in the Mahabharata, resists neat closure. Each argument about inevitability reveals more about the asker's values than about the past itself, reminding listeners that historical analysis is always a mirror held up to present concerns. Archaeologists and historians have tried to locate a real landscape behind the myth, searching for artifacts and places that might anchor the story in material evidence. These searches are intriguing but often inconclusive, and the quest itself has become part of the legend. Whether Kurukshetra was a single place or an idea, the pursuit of physical proof reveals how people long to root moral narratives in the earth. The fact that the search is ongoing keeps the story alive and present in everyday life. The psychological residue of Kurukshetra is another rich vein, and modern readers often focus on trauma and memory as long-term effects of such massive violence. Survivors and their descendants would have carried altered emotional patterns, suspicion, and a reconfiguration of social trust. These changes are not easily visible in chronicles of battle, but they are real, manifesting as shifts in rituals, in marriage strategies, and in political alliances. The war thus explains more than military history, it explains social psychology in times of rupture. Artists and filmmakers have repeatedly turned to Kurukshetra to dramatize the human face of conflict, and each adaptation reveals cultural priorities of its era. Some renditions foreground heroism, others highlight the futility of war, some are reverent, others critical. The persistence of these retellings shows the tale's malleability and its power to reflect contemporaneous social anxieties. Kurukshetra remains a canvas upon which societies paint their current dilemmas in colors borrowed from an ancient palette. There are also quieter, lesser-known tales braided into the main epic that illuminate daily life during the war: cooks who fed armies, women who wove banners, messengers who risked their lives carrying notes across no man's lands. These smaller narratives remind us that war is not fought by kings alone. It is carried by countless unnamed hands whose labor and loss are often invisible. Bringing these voices back into the story humanizes the broader sweep and shows that suffering during war is distributed unevenly but ubiquitously. Long after the final rites were performed, the land of Kurukshetra itself became a symbol of both sacredness and profane violence, a duality that held contradictory meanings for pilgrims and historians alike. Pilgrims sought purity of soul and redemption at places where, once, men had been slaughtered. They came seeking to touch a sacred ground whose holiness had been aired and baptized in pain. The coexistence of sanctity and bloodshed makes the place a powerful emblem of how human actions can wed the divine to the dreadful. Looking on Kurukshetra through a modern ethical lens, one is struck by the way its story complicates the idea of just war. The Mahabharata provides ethical frameworks, counsel, and paradoxes rather than simple answers. Its long dialogues teach that context matters, that duty can conflict with love, that wisdom may be cloaked in cunning, and that victory often arrives with moral costs. For contemporary thinkers, these lessons serve as both warning and guide in navigating the ethics of conflict and leadership. The personal tragedies of mothers who lost sons and of widows who would never remarry occupy a soft but persistent corner of the narrative's memory. These are the lives that reconstruct the communal fabric, carrying grief in ways that alter social practices and forms of kinship. The practical consequences, changed inheritance patterns, new social roles for widows, altered alliances, show how war reshapes societies in subtle, enduring ways. Studying these impacts reveals the long tail of violence, extending its shadow across generations. The caste and class dimensions of the war also invite scrutiny, as many fighters came not from royal stock but from lower backgrounds, pressed by alliances, obligation, or the promise of reward. Their motivations and experiences are less recorded yet no less crucial to understanding the war's machinery. Examining their roles demonstrates that epic conflicts rely on the mobilization of a broad base of society, which in turn bears the brunt of suffering. In this way, Kurukshetra resembles all great wars, where the lives of ordinary people are transformed by decisions made in halls of power. In the philosophical aftermath, many thinkers have appreciated the Mahabharata for showing that right action is seldom neat and that ethical living demands constant deliberation. The text teaches an ethics of complexity, where stubborn adherence to rules can lead to catastrophe and where reason must be balanced with compassion. This pragmatic ethic has appealed to rulers and moralists throughout history, who saw in the epic a guide for navigating the treacherous waters of governance and human desire. Overseas scholars have also found resonance in the story, comparing it to other epics and using it to understand universal themes of war, honor, and fate. These cross-cultural dialogues enrich the reading of Kurukshetra by placing it within a global conversation about how societies narrate conflict. By doing so, they reveal shared human concerns and unique cultural inflections, making the story both universal and particular. Such comparative work underscores the idea that while details differ, the human dilemmas at the heart of war remain strikingly similar across times and places. Even as nations modernized and weapons changed, the story of Kurukshetra retained its relevance because it addresses questions that technology cannot solve. How should leaders exercise power? How should people accept loss? And what responsibilities do we owe to future generations? These questions are timeless, and the war's narrative provides a space for their exploration. The fact that new generations return to the story shows that it does not become obsolete. Rather, it becomes a living manual for moral imagination. The forensic archaeology of the battlefield remains a contested field, with claims and counterclaims about artifacts, skeletal remains, and layers of habitation. Some excavations have suggested periods of conflict in the region, while others caution against direct correlation with the epic timeline. The uncertainty here becomes itself instructive. History does not always yield tidy answers, and myth and materiality often coexist in complex ways. Scholars and lay readers alike learn to accept nuanced conclusions and to value the interplay of evidence and narrative. The Mahabharata's stylistic richness, its digressions, embedded stories within stories, and philosophical tangents, gives the tale of Kurukshetra a unique texture that invites slow, reflective listening. The text does not aim for simplicity. It is layered, patient with its own complexity, and generous with perspectives. This narrative generosity allows listeners to find their own moral footholds within its vast topography. The war at Kurukshetra is thus not merely an event but a treasure trove of reflective possibilities. As winters passed and empires shifted, the battlefield's graves were tended or forsaken in cycles, and the memory of the war ebbed and flowed with political priorities. When new rulers sought legitimacy, they invoked the story and appealed to its symbols, sometimes using it to justify their own wars. When critics spoke against conquest, they used the tale as a moral exemplar of the horrors of unchecked ambition. The narrative proved adaptable, able to be used by many ends, which is both testament to its power and warning about the malleability of myth. The personal transformations of central figures, Yudhishthira's grappling with kingship, Arjuna's transition from paralyzing doubt to fierce engagement, Bhima's shift from appetite to reflective rage, offer a psychological arc that maps the human cost of war. These characters do not remain static archetypes. They evolve under pressure, and their growth is messy and incomplete. and their transformations are lessons about resilience, about the possibility of moral recalibration after catastrophe, and about the limits of personal change in the face of institutional trauma. There is also the recurring theme of prophecy and inevitability, which raises uncomfortable questions about free will. Characters often act as if some events are foreordained, yet their choices still bear moral weight. The tension between fate and agency is a persistent undercurrent. People who believe in destiny still can be praised or blamed for their actions. That ambiguity gives the story a resonant complexity, suggesting that even if certain ends were foretold, how those ends are met matters ethically. Ultimately, the war at Kurukshetra became a cultural horizon. It shaped laws, rituals, and political theory, and it worked as a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of untempered ambition. It also functioned as a repository of moral experimentation, a place where hypothetical answers to ethical dilemmas could be tried and dramatized. Its stories were retold to teach princes, to advise ministers, and to console those who had known private loss. The epic's staying power lies in its ability to speak to the perennial dilemmas of human life. When one attempts to tell the complete history of Kurukshetra, one realizes that complete is an aspiration rather than an achievable end. The war story branches into innumerable subplots, and each listener attaches personal significance to different threads. Some will dwell on tactical genius, others on personal tragedy, others on spiritual insight. The plurality of responses is itself part of the history. Kurukshetra is a mirror in which each generation sees a different reflection of its own concerns. Even the survivors' celebrations of victory were subdued by the knowledge that the land had been paid for in lives, and that currency could not be reclaimed. Festivities were shaded by funerary rites, and no triumphal parade could efface the funeral pyres that burned in memory. The paradox of triumph was thus laid bare. To win a kingdom is one thing, to live with the consequences is another. This tension would shape the politics of the nascent regime and the narratives passed down to children. The Mahabharata insists that women, although often marginalized in tales of battle, were deeply implicated in the war's causes and consequences. Draupadi, whose humiliation at the dice game was one of the critical triggers of the conflict, carries much of the moral weight of the story. Her voice and agency are central to the trauma that unfolded, and the treatment she received became a moral touchstone for the entire epic. The war cannot be understood without acknowledging how acts against women catalyzed and sustained male violence. In the end, Kurukshetra is a story about limits, limits of power, of justice, of human endurance. It warns against the arrogance of thinking that might can cleanly create right, and it shows the enormous cost when pride eclipses prudence. The field is a vortex where many limits were tested and found wanting, and the lessons are not easy or consoling. They remain stark and urgent, relevant to any age that wrestles with the question of how to use power without destroying what it aims to protect. Long epics like the Mahabharata endure because they allow listeners to witness extremes safely, to examine the edges of ethical life without immediately living them. The Kurukshetra narrative offers both spectacle and pedagogy. It lets people see what happens when pride and ambition are left unchecked, while also offering frameworks for rethinking action in the wake of harm. For this reason, the tale has been retold, re-examined, and argued over for centuries. Its endurance is a sign that the human appetite for moral complexity remains insatiable. So Kurukshetra stands as a complex monument, at once a battlefield and a classroom, a place where gods and men met and where human frailty and sublime courage were displayed side by side. The war's reverberations extended far beyond the arena of the conflict, shaping law, literature, religion, and individual lives. Its stories of heroes, traitors, victims, and sages provide no tidy moral. Rather, they offer a continuing conversation about what it means to act rightly in a world of competing duties and impossible choices. Listening to these stories invites the same careful deliberation that the characters themselves were forced to undertake, a process still relevant to anyone seeking to make ethical sense of power and loss. Long before kingdoms rose and fell on the soil of Bharata, the story that we call the Mahabharata was already a living, breathing thing in the mouths of storytellers and sages. It began as fragments of memory, as moral puzzles handed down beside the hearth, and as songs that braided human despair with divine intervention. Over time, those fragments took shape, expanding like a river fed by many streams, until a single vast narrative unrolled across generations. That narrative carries within it not only events but a philosophy, and at its heart rests a conversation between a warrior and a god that has guided countless lives. To understand the Mahabharata is to step into a world where the personal and the cosmic meet. Families stretch into dynasties, and dynasties carry the weight of oaths, debts, and the yearning for rightful rule. The central drama circles around two branches of a single royal house, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, whose rivalry grows until the soil itself seems to tremble under the march of armies. Yet the war that consumes them is not merely a battle of soldiers, it is an arena for questions about duty, justice, and the nature of action. The backdrop of this drama is the Kuru lineage, a family story marked by unusual births and solemn vows. It begins with King Shantanu, whose chance encounters and forbidden loves set the stage for future sorrow and sanctity. His marriage to Ganga and the later arrival of Bhima, bound to a terrible oath, weave into the tapestry of fate and free will. Each choice by these early figures echoes into the lives of those who follow, shaping the rules by which hearts and kingdoms are judged. Bhima stands like a pillar in the unfolding epic, a man who renounced his claim to the throne to uphold his father's happiness, and who later took an unbreakable vow that would haunt his house. In becoming the protector who refused the crown, he became a repository of duty and paradox. His strength is matched by his sorrow, for he watches the seeds of discord sprout where he once labored for unity. In his life, the Mahabharata begins to pose its central question: what is the right thing to do when all choices bring pain? From Bhima's era springs Vyasa, a sage of immense complexity, who both fathers upon the story itself. He is not merely a recorder of history but a participant whose actions, often morally ambiguous, shape destinies. Vyasa's relationships and decisions illustrate how the sacred and the flawed intertwine, teaching that even seers must exist within human imperfection. His role as storyteller reminds us that myths are crafted by those who have feet of clay and minds that touch the divine. The birth of the Pandavas arrives like a beam of light into an already tangled world. Pandu, their father, is cursed by a sage such that he cannot father children, and yet the blood of kings remains urgent and restless. Through divine boon and invocation, the brothers Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sadeva are born, each carrying unique gifts and flaws. Their virtue and valor are tested from the first, as if destiny demands that potential be wrestled into meaning. On the other side stand the Kauravas, 100 sons born to Dhritarashtra, the blind king, and his queen Gandhari. Led by Duryodhana, they are the living image of ambition and insecurity, conditioned by a sense of entitlement and a fear of being displaced. Their numbers are formidable, but in the Mahabharata every army is more than a tally of men, it is a constellation of ideas and impulses. Duryodhana's insistence on his rights turns familial rivalry into a cosmic trial. Draupadi enters the narrative as both bride and symbol, her life turning on questions of honor, agency, and the role of women in a patriarchal age. Married to the five Pandavas under strange and sacred circumstances, she becomes a focal point for honor and humiliation alike. The episode in which she is gambled away in a royal dice game marks a descent into moral bankruptcy that ripples outward. Her dignity, wronged before the court, summons the narrative toward its inevitable confrontation. The dice game itself is a somber lesson in the corrosion of reason by desire. Yudhishthira, the eldest and apparently the wisest, falls into a trap of pride and temptation. Cards and wagers become instruments of ruin. The Kauravas exploit human weakness, and what begins as a test of skill and luck becomes an orchestrated disgrace. That single night of loss and betrayal converts private infamy into public calamity, arming both sides with cause and consequence. Exile stretches the story across landscapes and inner territories, and in those wandering years the Pandavas encounter sages, wars, and wisdom that deepen their characters. They assume humble roles, gather allies, and learn the arts of kingship and war, but above all they are taught the limits of human control. The forests and courts they visit become classrooms where cosmic laws are whispered into ordinary ears. Each encounter prepares them for the ethical storm that will require choices with no fully good outcome. Behind the outward events, the epic persistently questions the nature of dharma, a complex term that blends duty, law, righteousness, and the right order of things. Dharma is not a fixed code laid down for all time. It bends and flexes with circumstance, and thus becomes both guide and riddle. Characters wrestle with dharma in moments of quiet as well as clamor, and the tension between personal duty and universal justice becomes the Mahabharata's central engine. The story demonstrates that the righteous path rarely arrives without sacrifice. Krishna's arrival in the story adds an entirely different texture, for he functions both as a worldly counselor and as the divine that holds the universe. Not content to stand outside destiny, he engages with it, steering hearts and hands toward outcomes that reveal deeper truths. His relationship with the Pandavas, especially Arjuna, is intimate and charged with the gravity of secret knowledge. Through Krishna, the Mahabharata shifts from history to philosophy, and the field of Kurukshetra becomes a stage where cosmic teachings are enacted. Kurukshetra itself is not just a place but an emblem, a field where duty and doubt collide. Armies arrayed on either side carry not only weapons but narratives of legitimacy. Kurukshetra becomes the crucible in which individual action shapes the moral fabric of the world, and where consequences are amplified into historical meaning. It is there that the culmination of countless choices will be revealed, and where the voice of divine counsel will become the decisive light for a faltering warrior. Arjuna's crisis before the battle is deeply human in its simplicity. Faced with the prospect of killing kin, teachers, and friends, he lays down his arms and asks, "What is the point?" His despair is not a failure of courage but a profound moral perplexity, and it is this moment that opens the space for Krishna's teaching. Arjuna personifies the modern listener who wants to act rightly but fears the cost, and his questions allow the Gita to speak to every age. In that exchange, the Mahabharata transcends its immediate setting and becomes an enduring guide to living. The Bhagavad Gita is presented as Krishna's counsel to Arjuna, a compact jewel of teaching embedded within the larger epic. It condenses ethical and metaphysical wisdom into an accessible conversation, making the complexities of duty, action, and liberation intelligible. Though it spans many themes, the Gita keeps returning to a practical question: how should one act in the world without being undone by attachment and despair? The answer is not a single command but a convergence of paths that align action with insight. Krishna begins by diagnosing Arjuna's paralysis as a confusion of identity and duty. He explains that the self is not merely the body but an enduring spirit that witnesses change. This distinction introduces the idea of death and duty. For the spirit, death is a transition, while it is the body that perishes. With these words, Krishna encourages Arjuna to see beyond immediate suffering and to act in communion with a larger order. One of the Gita's most famous teachings is the doctrine of action without attachment, where Krishna urges selfless performance of duty as a path to liberation. Acting without attachment does not mean inaction. It means doing what is necessary while relinquishing the selfish craving for results. Such action purifies the mind and prevents deeds from binding the soul with chains of desire and regret. The Gita thus reorients the ethic of doing away from the fruit to the quality of intent. Parallel to the teaching on duty comes the path of knowledge, wherein insight into the nature of reality dissolves fear. Krishna outlines a vision of the cosmos that is at once personal and impersonal, where the divine pervades all yet transcends all. Knowledge in this sense is not merely intellectual but liberating. It removes the veil of ignorance that causes suffering. By understanding the transient nature of the world, a seeker becomes less entangled with its pains. Equally important is the path of devotion, a theme Krishna weaves into the Gita with tenderness. Devotion, or bhakti, is presented as a loving orientation toward the divine that transforms mundane life into sacred practice. Krishna suggests that a heart full of love and surrender can achieve union with the divine even when intellectual clarity lags. In this way, the Gita honors emotion as a vehicle of truth, not merely as distraction from it. The Gita also explores various forms of yoga as methods for aligning self with reality. Yoga here is practical. It is a discipline for the mind, breath, and action that cultivates steadiness. Whether through disciplined action, contemplative knowledge, or devoted love, yoga offers structured ways to meet life's demands without losing the center. Krishna speaks not of abstract ideals but of practices that can be woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Krishna's cosmology in the Gita is startling in its vividness. He reveals a universal form that dissolves Arjuna's anxieties and expands his vision. In that momentary vision, the limited self glimpses multiplicity and unity at once, seeing creation as both dazzling and terrifying. The experience is designed to show that the divine contains all outcomes, that destiny and duty are not random but participate in a grander intelligence. For Arjuna, it is a turning point, a dispelling of doubt and a call to act. But the Gita is not merely metaphysical insight. It is a stern and practical ethic for leadership and warfare. Krishna instructs Arjuna not to be swayed by sentiment when duty calls, especially the duty of a ruler and protector. Ethics here are grounded in roles and consequences. The warrior's dharma requires confronting injustice, even at terrible cost. The battlefield thus becomes a moral test where inner clarity must guide ruthless action. The teaching on equality of vision is another core lesson. Krishna describes the wise as seeing the same self in a child, in an old man, in a friend, and in a foe. Such equanimity arises when desire and aversion cease to repaint the world in self-serving colors. From this standpoint, the distinctions that normally shape life dissolve into a broader compassion. Krishna's counsel is both radical and humane, to recognize unity without denying particular duties. As the dialogue unfolds, Krishna addresses the consequences of action and the law of cause and effect. He explains that actions rooted in ignorance and selfishness create bondage, while actions performed with wisdom and detachment free the spirit. Karma, then, is not a simple moral ledger but a dynamic process that can either entangle or liberate. Understanding this permits one to act with a clarity that reduces harm and fosters spiritual growth. The Gita's final chapters converge on surrender as the culmination of discipline, knowledge, and love. Krishna invites Arjuna to offer his entire being in trust, to surrender the ego that clings and judges. This surrender is not meek resignation but an active alignment with the source that sustains all action. It is portrayed as both an ethical act and a spiritual consummation. The warrior who surrenders becomes a channel of rightness rather than a source of conflict. When Arjuna rises from the counsel of Krishna, his resolve is reborn and tempered by clarity. He accepts his role with a new understanding of the stakes and the means. The battle that follows is fought not just with arrows but with the purified intention that Krishna helped cultivate. The narrative suggests that what is won on the field is secondary to the inner conquest, the reformation of heart and mind that makes action worthy. Yet the Mahabharata does not reduce greatness to victory. Even in triumph there are heavy costs, and the epic dwells on the pain of loss, the ruin of families, and the heavy price of power. The post-war scenes are haunted by grief and disillusionment as survivors confront what victory demanded. These scenes teach that moral triumph is not synonymous with worldly success, and that compassion and reflection must follow even necessary action. The destruction that concludes the war invites meditation on the transient nature of empires and the frailty of human projects. The survivors are forced to reckon with the emptiness of trophies and the countless small lives consumed by conflict. The Mahabharata uses this aftermath to remind listeners that if the pursuit of justice strips away one's capacity for compassion, the victory is Pyrrhic. The text thus encourages a broader lens through which to judge political action. In the epic's later chapters, the death of Bhima on the bed of arrows offers a long, didactic sequence in which he imparts wisdom about kingship, social order, and spiritual life. From his immobile vantage he becomes a last, authoritative voice on how countless decisions should have been made. His teachings are a blend of the practical and the ideal, offering guidance for rulers and commoners alike. These discourses expand the Mahabharata's moral universe beyond the immediate story into a manual for living. The Pandavas' rule following the war is marked by uneasy peace, and even as they fulfill their duties, their hearts remain uneasy. The throne sits heavy under the weight of remembrance and remorse. Their era illuminates the paradox of taking power to establish righteousness while recognizing that power inevitably leaves scars. It is a sober reminder that good intentions cannot erase human fallibility. Eventually, the Pandavas renounce their kingdom and go on a final pilgrimage toward the Himalayas, seeking to transcend the worldly attachments that bound them. This ascent is both literal and symbolic, a last attempt to reach a place beyond the cycles of desire and duty. Along the way they fall one by one, each loss revealing an attachment that still clings. In the end, only Yudhishthira reaches the gates of heaven with his human frailty intact, illustrating the difficult path of moral ascent. Beyond the central arc, the Mahabharata brims with subsidiary tales, interpolations, and philosophical dialogues that deepen its texture. Stories within stories, of sages, princes, gods, and ordinary people, enrich the moral palette and show how the same dilemmas repeat across lives. Those side narratives provide relief and resonance, revealing that the core tensions of duty, love, and law are universal. Together they create a literary cosmos that invites lifelong study. The composition of the Mahabharata itself is a story worth attention. Centuries of oral transmission, regional recensions, and later Sanskrit redactions converged into the form we now encounter. Those layers mean that the epic is not monolithic but dialogic. It contains conflicting viewpoints and moral ambiguities that authors and audiences wrestled with over time. That plurality is part of its power because it refuses simplistic conclusions and asks readers to participate in ethical complexity. Central to the epic is the notion that gods and humans interact in fluid ways, sometimes indistinguishable in purpose and presence. Deities descend to advise, to test, and to intervene, yet humans remain agents with real responsibility. This interplay challenges modern categories that separate religion from politics or the divine from the human. The Mahabharata insists on a world where the sacred and the mundane are braided, where cosmic meaning emerges through human action. The text's moral ambiguity is intentional rather than accidental. It invites listeners to inhabit difficult choices rather than offering easy absolutes. Heroes act with courage and cruelty, sages speak truth and error, and kings make decisions that blur right and wrong. These contradictions teach that real ethics must grapple with trauma and complexity, not retreat into purest abstractions. The epic, therefore, becomes a moral laboratory for readers to test their own convictions. One of the Mahabharata's abiding lessons concerns the perils of unchecked desire and envy. Duryodhana's jealousy and Yudhishthira's weakness for gambling are concrete illustrations of how small flaws accumulate into catastrophe. Desire not only fuels personal downfall but also corrupts institutions and erodes trust, a lesson that resonates across time. The epic uses these character flaws to show that virtues isolated from self-knowledge and restraint can be tragically inadequate. Another recurrent theme is the sanctity of vows and the consequences of oath-breaking, which the narrative treats with moral seriousness. Bhishma's vow, Gandhari's blindfolded partnership, and Yudhishthira's commitments all highlight how promises create social fabric. When vows are broken, the social order frays and violence often becomes the language of repair. The Mahabharata thus holds that words, when committed, bind a person as tightly as chains. The role of women in the Mahabharata is complex and often paradoxical, revealing both the constraints placed upon them and their profound agency. Draupadi, Kunti, Gandhari, and others influence events through decisions made in constrained circumstances, wielding power not always visible in the halls of kings. Their voices articulate pain and moral outrage, and often their suffering catalyzes the narrative's moral energy. By attending to female perspectives, the epic enlarges its ethical reach. Moral education in the Mahabharata is not didactic in an uncomplicated way. It is pedagogical through conflict, example, and debate. Sages and kings debate policy, householders model virtues, and children emulate heroes who are themselves inconsistent. This method of moral learning through narrative shows that wisdom arises from the friction of differing positions rather than from single-minded doctrine. Children and rulers alike learn that good judgment requires interpretation, not rote adherence to rules. The Mahabharata's ecological imagination is surprisingly vivid, reminding listeners that battles and politics impact the land, animals, and common people in deep ways. Forests shelter sages and fugitives, rivers become boundaries of contest, and the fate of agriculture marks the prosperity of kingdoms. The text subtly insists that human action must account for non-human life, because the health of the polity depends on the health of the environment. This sensitivity lends the epic a timeless relevance. In its depictions of kingship, the Mahabharata balances ideals of competence with the messy reality of politics. A king must be just, brave, and wise, yet he must also navigate alliances, intrigues, and material constraints. This tension between moral ideal and practical necessity recurs throughout the narrative, and it teaches that leadership demands both ethical clarity and political acumen. The ideal ruler is a moral exemplar who also understands the art of governance. The Mahabharata also offers an extended meditation on friendship and counsel, especially in the relationship between Krishna and Arjuna. A genuine friend, the epic suggests, does not flatter but illuminates hard truths, and sometimes compels action that is spiritually edifying if personally painful. Counsel in the epic is most valuable when it refuses to relieve the seeker of responsibility while providing a path for action. True friendship, therefore, becomes a vehicle of moral transformation. Music, poetry, and ritual are interwoven into the epic, signifying that culture and religion are not separate from politics but sustain and reflect social values. Ceremonies legitimize kings, bards shape memory, and prayers align ordinary lives with cosmic rhythms. The Mahabharata recognizes the aesthetic as a moral force, because stories sung and rituals performed bind communities and transmit norms across generations. Culture, in this sense, becomes a trainer of souls. The epic's narrative technique, stories within stories, counsel framed by events, and dialogues that explode into dense moral debates, creates a listening experience crafted for deep attention. The text seems aware it is addressing an audience that must hold many ideas together at once, and it structures itself to echo the mental process of wrestling with duty. For a listener today, this method invites immersion, not as passive entertainment, but as an active moral engagement. Listening becomes a form of practice. The Bhagavad Gita's philosophical strands have been read in many ways across time, some emphasizing action, others contemplation, and still others love. The Gita's genius is that it does not privilege one path to the exclusion of others. Rather, it teaches that discipline, insight, and devotion are complementary. Different temperaments are invited to different doors of the same house, and the house leads inward to the same source. This pluralism has enabled the Gita to speak across cultures and epochs. Interpretations of the Gita have varied widely, shaped by the priorities of later teachers and movements. Medieval Bhakti saints heard Krishna's call as an affirmation of loving surrender, while medieval philosophers emphasized knowledge and renunciation. In modern times, political leaders and thinkers have drawn upon the Gita to justify action or contemplation, depending on their agendas. The text's openness allows multiple readings, which is both its strength and its complexity. The Gita's influence extends far beyond religious practice into philosophy, literature, and political thought. Western thinkers encountered its teachings with fascination, seeing in its Stoic counsel echoes of other ethical systems. Its metaphors and prescriptions have entered global philosophical conversation, often translated and retranslated, sometimes misread, and sometimes illuminating. The Gita thus participates in a worldwide dialogue about what it means to live rightly amid turmoil. Listening to the Mahabharata and the Gita today, one is struck by their psychological acuity. The inner lives of characters are mapped with a sensitivity to fear, pride, grief, and desire that makes them enduringly human. The text anticipates modern insights about trauma and moral injury, offering interpretations that help soothe and explain inner turmoil. It comforts not by easy answers but by offering frameworks for understanding why pain arises and how to move through it. The moral complexity of the epic has provoked criticism as well as reverence. Some readers lament its patriarchal structures, its acceptance of certain social hierarchies, and its occasional rationales for violence. Such critiques are important and invite contemporary listeners to engage critically with the text rather than worship it unthinkingly. The Mahabharata, then, becomes a site of conversation between past norms and present values. Despite its age, the epic remains startlingly modern in its preoccupation with law, legitimacy, and the responsibilities of public office. Questions about when force is justified, the morality of deception for a greater good, and the price of political stability have immediate contemporary resonance. The Gita's guidance on acting without attachment also speaks to leaders who must make decisions that affect many while guarding against personal ambition. Thus, ancient counsel continues to inform modern governance. The Mahabharata's teachings on death and the afterlife are understated but profound. Death is not a final erasure but a transition, and fear of death should not cripple right action. Krishna's words about the permanence of the spirit and the impermanence of the body offer solace and a perspective that recalibrates fear. The epic confronts mortality not as an abstract metaphysical puzzle but as a practical problem that affects how people act when confronted with loss. This pragmatic spirituality is one reason why people turn to the epic in times of grief. The narrative also emphasizes the duty to speak truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, but it recognizes that truth sometimes wears many faces. Characters face moral dilemmas in which lying may spare harm or where speaking may cause collapse. The epic does not give simple slogans for such dilemmas. Instead, it asks listeners to weigh consequences, intentions, and the greater good, challenging them to cultivate wisdom rather than slogans. The Mahabharata's truth is thus an ethical practice, not a mere statement. A striking dimension of the epic is its psychological realism. Men and women are described in scenes of domestic tenderness, dry wit, and brutal rage, rather than as archetypes. Bhima's appetite, Arjuna's melancholy, Yudhishthira's sorrow, and Duryodhana's resentment read like a human registry of passion and weakness. This realism makes the characters trustworthy companions in moral reflection, because their strengths are always shadowed by human limitations. The epic teaches by example rather than abstraction. The role of fate and free will is a continual friction point in the narrative. On one hand, prophecies and divine plans suggest an unfolding destiny. On the other, individual choices pivot the course of events. The Mahabharata holds both views in tension, suggesting that fate sets the stage but free will fills the roles with meaningful action. This nuanced stance helps listeners reconcile the sense of preordination with the moral urgency of choice. The epic's portrayal of war is unromantic and raw, revealing not only glory but waste, suffering, and the disintegration of civil life. Tactics and heroism are described in detail, but the primary focus is on the human consequences. Widows mourn, fields lie fallow, and the moral currency of the nation is degraded. By refusing to flatten war into mythic triumph, the Mahabharata teaches the moral cost of violence and the need to exhaust peaceful remedies before conflict. Such realism is often absent in simplistic celebrations of battle. At the center of the Gita's ethics stands the ideal of inner detachment, to act with full involvement while remaining undisturbed by outcomes. This paradoxical stance is what allows action to be both effective and non-binding, and it becomes a training in equanimity. Detachment is not indifference but an informed love that recognizes the limits of control. The practice of detachment thus fosters resilience in the face of inevitable loss. The Gita's psychological tools, disciplined attention, steady breath, ethical focus, read like a manual for someone trying to keep their mind steady amid crisis. These techniques are not mystical tricks but practical advice for cultivating clarity. Whether one applies them to a battlefield, a courtroom, or a kitchen, the underlying instruction is the same: steady the inner condition and the outer performance gains integrity. This universality explains the Gita's enduring appeal. Philosophically, the Gita synthesizes elements of Sankhya thought, Upanishadic insight, and devotional practice into a coherent way of life. It borrows the analytical rigor of Sankhya, the spiritual depth of Upanishads, and the warmth of Bhakti, blending them into teachings that are simultaneously speculative and practical. This synthesis allows the Gita to be both a metaphysical map and a handbook for daily virtue. It bridges theory and practice in a way that invites continuous exploration. Krishna's final instructions in the Gita emphasize surrender and trust, urging practitioners to offer the fruits of their actions to the divine. This offering is not a denial of responsibility but a reorientation of it, an act of humility that sanctifies work. When action becomes an offering, it loses its selfish energy and transforms into service. Such transformation is central to the Gita's ethical architecture. The Mahabharata's cultural influence cannot be overstated. It shaped ritual practice, legal thought, political ideals, and artistic imagination across the subcontinent and beyond. Its stories are enacted in theater, painted on temple walls, and reinterpreted in novels and films. The characters become archetypes that inform collective identity and moral aspiration. This cultural saturation means the epic functions both as scripture and as national epic, informing public conscience in multiple registers. Even as the epic spreads across art and ritual, it remains resistant to simplistic allegory. Scholars and saints alike have tried to map characters onto philosophical concepts, but the text resists reducing human lives to mere symbols. The Mahabharata prefers messy realism to neat morality plays, and this makes it a richer source for reflection. Its resistance to one-to-one allegory keeps it alive, because each generation must wrestle anew with its questions. One of the most potent messages of the Mahabharata is that suffering is neither meaningless nor purely punitive. It is a school that, if rightly approached, can foster awakening. Pain exposes the edges of ignorance and can prompt the search for deeper truth. The epic does not glorify suffering but shows how adversity can be transmuted into wisdom through disciplined reflection and moral courage. This view uplifts human resilience without sentimentalizing suffering. The story of Karna is especially poignant in its exploration of loyalty, honor, and social stigma. Born of a secret and a cruel twist of fate, Karna's life tests the fairness of a society that judges by birth and not by merit. His generosity and martial prowess stand beside his enduring loneliness and compromised loyalties, making him one of the epic's most tragic figures. Through Karna, the Mahabharata interrogates justice and the human cost of rigid hierarchies. The concept of righteous violence in the epic is difficult and uncomfortable, and the Mahabharata does not resolve the discomfort but invites sustained engagement with it. When violence is presented as necessary, it is never sanitized. The text dwells on consequences and calls for deep remorse. Warriors perform their duty but do not emerge unscarred, a portrayal that deepens the ethical conversation. The epic begins to look less like a hymn to war and more like a cautionary tale about the limits of force. Penance and discipline are recurrent motifs in the Mahabharata, where heroes and villains alike undergo ascetic trials to gain insight or power. Such practices are presented as methods of cultivating inner strength and moral clarity rather than as ends in themselves. The epic reveals that spiritual practice must be integrated with ethical life. Renunciation alone does not suffice, nor does action without inner transformation. This integration is a key lesson for audiences seeking coherence between belief and behavior. The role of speech and rhetoric in the epic is notable. Kings and sages wield words as instruments of persuasion, law, and sanction. Debate is a central mode of resolving disputes, even when it eventually fails and arms are taken up. The Mahabharata suggests that speech must be cultivated with care because it can both create community and incite ruin. Thus, eloquence becomes a moral skill, as important as martial training. Stories of redemption and failure are scattered throughout the epic, reminding listeners that moral life is an arc, not a snapshot. Characters sometimes repent and transform, while others remain obstinately blind to insight. The narrative tracks these changes over time, showing that moral development is often halting and imperfect. This realism is consoling because it permits growth without the illusion of instant purity. The Mahabharata's spiritual cosmology includes a vision of cyclical time, where ages repeat and moral patterns recur, suggesting that human problems are both eternal and historically particular. This cyclical view does not absolve people of responsibility but frames action within a long arc that invites patience and perseverance. By placing personal struggle in a cosmic rhythm, the epic situates individual choices within a tapestry that stretches across eras. The epic's narrative voice is at once stern and compassionate, often stepping in to comment on the ethical dimensions of events and to address the reader or listener directly. This conversation within the conversation creates intimacy, as if a wise counselor sits by the listener's side. Such direct address transforms the Mahabharata into not merely a story but a living mentor that speaks across centuries. This voice trains the listener to hear wisdom in diverse forms. Religious practices inspired by the Mahabharata and Gita range from contemplative meditation to ritual devotion, each offering distinctive ways to embody the teachings. Some readers find solace in the Gita's meditative techniques, while others find liberation in devotional surrender or in ethical service. The multiplicity of practices underscores the Gita's inclusive vision. Different temperaments find different doors to the same interior city. Thus, practice becomes both personal and communal. In modern times, the Mahabharata has been reinterpreted in novels, plays, films, and scholarly works that bring new perspectives to ancient dilemmas. Contemporary authors often reframe female voices, explore marginalized perspectives, or question traditional hierarchies, renewing the epic's relevance. These retellings demonstrate the epic's adaptability and its capacity to speak to changing social concerns. They keep the story alive by making it speak to modern listeners' ethical anxieties. The Gita's psychological counsel has been adapted into secular contexts, informing practices in leadership training, therapy, and mindfulness. Its teachings about calm action under pressure and clarity of purpose resonate with those seeking practical tools for modern life. The universal applicability of some of its core insights has helped the Gita travel beyond religious boundaries without losing its spiritual depth. This cross-cultural reception confirms the text's enduring practicality. The Mahabharata's moral pedagogy often relies on the lived consequences of choices rather than on abstract prescriptions, teaching through narrative consequence rather than lecture. Each decision leads to outcomes that teach both characters and readers about the hidden price of action. In this sense, the epic is a moral simulation, inviting listeners to imagine themselves in situations and learn through empathetic engagement. The method is as effective as any philosophical treatise because it embeds theory within emotion and story. The Gita's insistence on inner steadiness amid outer duty speaks directly to anyone balancing competing responsibilities, whether as parent, citizen, or professional. Its counsel to prioritize intention over consequence and to cultivate detachment helps reduce the paralysis that often accompanies high-stakes decision-making. In a world of volatile outcomes, the Gita's practices offer psychological tools to retain integrity while acting effectively. This practical spiritual psychology is central to its perennial appeal. The Mahabharata's final teaching is perhaps its most sobering. Even the victorious and the wise must face the consequences of their lives and learn to let go. The epic closes not with triumphant certainty but with a quiet path into renunciation and reflection. Its end invites listeners to ask what matters when power fades and all possessions are left behind. In doing so, it points toward a humility that should temper all ambitions. Across its expanse, the Mahabharata weaves political realism with spiritual aspiration, making it a unique repository of human wisdom. It refuses to offer simple formulas for success or easy assurances for troubled souls. Instead, it furnishes tools, stories that hone the listener's moral imagination, teachings that guide action, and prayers that comfort the heart. Its usefulness lies in its willingness to stay with difficulty rather than to erase it. The epic also attends to the ethics of leadership under uncertainty, offering counsel about counsel itself, how rulers should hear, weigh, and decide. Heightened attention to the supply of good advisors and the cultivation of self-awareness are recurring themes, because leaders who lack these qualities risk disastrous decisions. The Mahabharata thus stands as a manual for moral governance, reminding rulers that legitimacy depends on more than force, it depends on wisdom and restraint. Although rooted in a specific cultural and historical milieu, the Mahabharata engages questions that are universal. What makes an action right? How should one balance personal loyalty against justice? And what is the nature of a life well lived? It invites listeners into a global conversation about moral ambiguity, suffering, and the search for meaning. This universality is why its stories continue to travel across time and culture. The Gita's spiritual psychology invites a practice of continual self-examination, recommending humility and perseverance as antidotes to misery. The steady cultivation of awareness, ethical action, and devotion forms a triangular support for the seeker. Even when perfect knowledge remains out of reach, these practices foster a life of growing clarity and compassionate action. They are not quick fixes but long-term transformations. The Mahabharata's ethical scope includes the small acts of kindness that preserve the social fabric, reminding listeners that great moral gestures are often rooted in countless tiny decisions. Hospitality, truth-telling, restraint in speech, and fidelity to small duties all accumulate into the character of a people. These minor virtues receive as much narrative attention as heroic exploits, teaching that morality is built in the soil of daily life. The epic therefore celebrates the ordinary as much as the extraordinary. In its portrayal of remorse and repentance, the epic teaches that acknowledgement of error is itself a moral act that can mitigate harm. Characters who confess and make restitution often redeem some portion of their dignity, even if not all consequences can be undone. The process of repair is complex and sometimes incomplete, but it is nonetheless necessary. The Mahabharata thus models moral maturity as the capacity to face one's faults and labor to mend what one can. The story's spiritual dimension culminates not in escape from the world but in the transformation of how one engages with it, encouraging active participation carried out with wisdom. The Gita frames liberation as compatible with engaged life, teaching that one can perform duties while progressing spiritually. This integrated approach refuses the sterile dichotomy between worldliness and holiness. It promises a path where action becomes an expression of insight. The Mahabharata's power to teach lies in its invitation to empathy. By inhabiting many minds and performing many roles, the listener learns to see the world through others' eyes. Each character becomes a mirror reflecting possible virtues and pitfalls within the self. This imaginative practice trains moral sensitivity and widens perspective. It converts reading into a moral exercise as strenuous and necessary as any ritual. The saga's psychological realism makes its tragedies instructive rather than merely sensational. Suffering becomes a teacher, and events that might have been mere plot turn into moral laboratories. The epic asks readers to hold sorrow alongside meaning, to recognize that pain often catalyzes insight. The lessons derived from grief are central to the Mahabharata's spiritual pedagogy. It thus becomes a companion in times of personal trial. The Gita concludes with a promise that sincere seekers, regardless of their social station, can approach the divine through discipline, knowledge, or devotion. This accessibility is democratizing and radical in its own way, because it refuses to confine liberation to a privileged caste or class. Anyone who takes up the practices can find a path inward. This openness has fueled the Gita's broad appeal across centuries. The Mahabharata's critique of pride is relentless. Arrogance leads to isolation and blinds rulers and heroes to counsel and compromise. Where humility is present, counsel flourishes and communities thrive. Where pride dominates, conflict escalates. This simple moral keeps appearing in one form or another, inviting listeners to test their own egotism. The epic thus serves as a mirror to the soul's vanity. The epic's literary craft, its dense imagery, dramatic dialogue, and evocative scenes, supports its ethical teaching by making moral dilemmas viscerally felt rather than abstractly stated. Readers and listeners are drawn into scenes of banquet, battle, lamentation, and counsel in ways that sharpen moral intuition. The narrative's aesthetic power makes ethical learning memorable and emotionally resonant. This marriage of form and content is a reason why the Mahabharata remains an enduring work of art and moral education. The Mahabharata also functions as a cultural archive, preserving ancient notions of law, kinship, and ritual while inviting reinterpretation. Its stories inform legal precedents and social norms, but they do so in a way that keeps their meanings alive and contested. Scholars, priests, and poets have all turned to the epic to argue, to teach, and to inspire. The text's longevity owes much to this capacity to be continually reworked without losing its essential core. The epic's many dialogues between conflicting voices provide a model for democratic deliberation. Competing claims are aired and sometimes reconciled, but the process itself is valued. Even where debate fails and force intervenes, the narrative emphasizes that reasoned argument should be the first resort. The Mahabharata thus offers a civic ethic that prizes discourse as a means of resolving disputes. It teaches that talk matters and that good counsel can avert catastrophe. The Gita's metaphors, of the charioteer and the chariot, the battlefield as a theater of duty, are vivid tools for moral psychology that remain instructive. The image of the self as charioteer guiding passions and senses invokes an inner discipline that is both ancient and immediate. Such metaphors translate abstract teaching into living practice, making spiritual work imaginable. They provide ready images for meditation and guidance. In the end, the Mahabharata admonishes listeners to take responsibility for the world by first taking responsibility for themselves. Social reform and justice begin with personal transformation, because collective structures are built by individuals. The epic's insistence on internal work as the foundation for external change is a sobering balm for those longing for quick fixes. It calls us to the slow work of character. The story's conclusion, with the Pandavas' final renunciation and the fading of the old order, evokes the inevitability of change and the dignity of letting go. It teaches that every epic has its heroes and its errors, and that wisdom includes the capacity to retire gracefully from the stage. The Mahabharata thus closes with a lesson in humility and surrender, a gentle coda to a life of difficult choices. Listening to the Mahabharata as a living text offers an ongoing education in moral discernment, practical ethics, and spiritual cultivation. Its dialogues with despair and hope, action and renunciation, make it a companion for those seeking guidance in complex times. The Gita, embedded within, remains a handbook for steadying the soul amid storm. Both, together, provide a narrative laboratory for learning how to act without self-annihilation. For the modern listener, the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita provide frameworks for understanding leadership, ethical action, and the psychology of stress and duty. Their tools are adaptable to many contexts, from family life to public office, and their tests remain relevant because human nature has not changed as much as the world around us. These texts ask us to cultivate courage, wisdom, and compassion within a world that will always demand hard choices. The final, enduring lesson may be this: truth is complex, duty is costly, and love demands courage. The Mahabharata does not grant easy consolation, but it does offer a path for those willing to walk it, honestly, sacrificially, and with the awareness that actions ripple beyond immediate sight. If one listens closely, the epic teaches how to stand in the field of life with clear intention, steady heart, and an open hand. That is its promise and its challenge. There is a certain hush that falls over a listener when the word Mahabharata is spoken, as if an old room has been opened and sunlight is streaming in on a long, layered past. The epic arrives not as a single narrative but as a living river, carrying tributaries of story, law, ritual, and philosophy, all moving together toward a coastline that is forever changing. To begin with the Mahabharata is to step into a world in which kings and sages, quarrels and counsel, war and psalm are braided with questions about duty, truth, and the shape of a good life. The tale of the Kuru family that anchors the Mahabharata is familiar in broad outline: two branches, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, a contested throne, an exilic return, and a great war on the field of Kurukshetra. But even this simple scaffold gives rise to 100 interwoven lives and choices, and the tension between kinship and kingship repeatedly refracts into new moral and political dilemmas. It is here, in the tension and its consequences, that the epic becomes more than history or myth. It becomes a mirror that has reflected and refracted social thought across generations. We can think of the Mahabharata as a composite work shaped by centuries of oral and written transmission, edited and expanded by many hands, voices, and moments. It is credited traditionally to Vyasa, a figure who is at once author, character, and symbol of the story's own layered production. Scholars who trace linguistic and stylistic strata find evidence of accretions and revisions reflecting changing religious, social, and political climates, and this palimpsest quality gives the epic its extraordinary capacity to adapt. By the time the text reached a relatively stable written form, it had become an encyclopedic repository of thought. The narrative arc of the Great War contains within it discussions of dharma, economic life, ritual practice, and metaphysical speculation. Interpolations like the Bhagavad Gita, which appears as a dialogue between Prince Arjuna and Krishna at a pivotal battlefield moment, have themselves taken on lives of their own. The Gita reads like a sudden condensation of spiritual instruction embedded within a dramatic crisis, and it has been read and reread across centuries as a compact manual of action and devotion. What holds the Mahabharata together is not only plot but a moral grammar that refuses moral simplicity. Characters are rarely wholly good or wholly bad, Their virtues and failings exist alongside each other, and decisions that seem right in one context can yield disaster in another. This ambivalence is part of the epic's power. It invites readers and listeners into an ongoing ethical conversation rather than handing down definitive answers. The result is a narrative ethic that prizes nuance, context, and the necessity of facing consequences. The Pandavas, 5 brothers raised with both affection and rivalry, are often positioned as the protagonists, yet each brings complexities that challenge easy sympathy. Yudhishthir, the eldest, is a figure of principled restraint and burdened truthfulness, yet his adherence to vows can lead to tragic passivity. Bhima, possessed of monstrous strength, embodies loyalty and appetite, and Arjuna, the warrior of unmatched skill, becomes the focal point for questions about the righteousness of violence and the duties of a warrior. Meanwhile, Draupadi, central to the story and often spoken of only in relation to the 5 brothers, emerges as a figure of dignity, anger, and agency whose humiliation at the hands of the Kauravas becomes the moral lever that tips the course toward war. Her voice, her suffering, and her insistence upon justice complicate the ostensibly male-centered narrative and remind us that questions of honor and retribution are bound in gendered power. Her role invites listeners to dwell on the costs of patriarchal codes and the ways women's lives and words shape public events. The Kauravas, led by the obstinate Duryodhana and his counselor Drona and uncle Shakuni, represent the forces of ambition, envy, and political cunning. They are not monsters created for easy vanquishing but family men and flawed rulers whose maneuvers speak to the fragility of monarchic legitimacy. Their story warns about the primacy of desire and the ease with which counsel can be twisted toward self-interest, and it asks how institutions can channel or contain human passion. If the Mahabharata is first a story of dynastic dispute, it is also a meditation on kingship and the large question of what holds a polity together. The epic's many debates about law, governance, and duty are less theoretical abstractions than practical wrestling with how people should live collectively. Beyond the battlefield, the Mahabharata spends enormous energy on forms of statecraft, the rights that legitimize power, and the ethical limits of political calculation, suggesting that war is never merely a clash of armies but a breakdown of ordered obligation. The battlefield itself, Kurukshetra, is a stage for layered symbolism as much as historical drama. It is consecrated land where moral and cosmic orders are tested, and the great narrative makes the field both a place of material death and of spiritual revelation. The conversation between Arjuna and Krishna in the middle of the battlefield is both timely and timeless. It transforms a moment of existential paralysis into a teaching about action, duty, and the nature of the self. It is a conversion scene, a philosophical crux, and a theological manifesto all at once. Krishna's role in the Mahabharata is complex and central. He is strategist, charioteer, friend, and divine teacher, and the epic uses him to trouble distinctions between human agency and cosmic will. For some characters, he is a god-man whose presence justifies actions that would otherwise seem unforgivable. For others, he is a counselor whose cunning is morally problematic. The Mahabharata never resolves the ambiguity entirely. It allows Krishna to be both a manifestation of the divine and an actor who manipulates human choices, thereby provoking ongoing debates about means and ends. The epic's view of violence is not romanticized. The vivid descriptions of battle, the inventory of casualties, and the grief that follows victory make clear that violence is a last and terrible recourse. Yet the text also examines how the structures of honor, vengeance, and political exigency can generate a cascade of decisions that make war seem inevitable. This tension between moral horror and political necessity keeps the narrative alive and keeps listeners asking whether any war can be fully justified. Embedded within the tale are numerous subplots and stories, tales of kings, ascetics, lovers, and tricksters that expand the world of the epic and offer moral counterpoints to the central narrative. These embedded stories function as ethical case studies, parables that reflect on the larger action or provide a mirror to the souls of the protagonists. As listeners move from one embedded tale to another, they are invited to compare motives and outcomes, to see patterns of human behavior across different contexts. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mahabharata is how it absorbs philosophical currents and makes them integral to narrative life. Sections devoted to cosmology, metaphysics, and the nature of reality sit alongside practical discussions of law and ritual, suggesting that the ancient imagination did not separate the life of thought from the life of action. The result is a text that serves both as a cultural myth and as a platform for intellectual discourse, a place where different ways of knowing coexist and confront each other. Because the Mahabharata functions on so many levels, different readers and traditions have emphasized different strands. Some have focused on its legalistic and ethical sections, using the text as a normative guide. Others have been drawn to its spiritual chapters, especially the Bhagavad Gita, reading the epic as a philosophical and devotional resource. This multiplicity of readings is part of what has allowed the Mahabharata to remain relevant across contexts and centuries. The transmission of the Mahabharata into written form owes much to the social realities of South Asia. Patronage, temple culture, and the rise of regional courts fostered contexts in which stories could be composed, copied, and performed. But before writing became widespread, the epic circulated in oral communities where bards and storytellers adapted episodes to local tastes and circumstances. This oral performance culture ensured that the Mahabharata could be a living tradition, changing shape as it passed from teller to teller. Regional retellings and vernacular versions have transformed the epic into innumerable local classics. In Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, Marathi, and dozens of other languages, poets and dramatists reworked the narrative to reflect local idioms, social concerns, and devotional priorities. These versions sometimes elevate different characters, shift the emphasis of particular episodes, or introduce new material, underscoring the epic's elasticity and its capacity to absorb diverse cultural energies. Performance traditions, katha, puppetry, theater, and later film and television have been vital in popularizing the Mahabharata and shaping public understanding. Storytellers and performers make choices about pacing, emphasis, and characterization, and those choices have a profound influence on how communities interpret the text. A single episode staged as a moral sermon or as a tragic rehearsal can produce very different emotional responses and social interpretations. The Mahabharata's impact on law and social custom is more than metaphorical. Rulers and jurists historically invoked the epic for models of just governance and legal precedent, and its discussions of caste, kingship, and justice informed legal discourse for centuries. Yet the epic's moral ambiguity also provided space for reinterpretation, and commentators often debated how its lessons should apply to changing social circumstances. This dynamic interplay between text and interpretation helped make the Mahabharata a resource for legal and ethical reflection. Religious traditions have also folded the Mahabharata into their own frameworks. In devotional Vaishnavism, for example, Krishna's role is elevated and the Gita is sometimes read as a deeply theological treatise. Meanwhile, ascetic and Vedantic readings emphasize renunciation and the illusory nature of worldly attachments, drawing on sections of the epic that explore the tension between action and liberation. The text's capacity to speak to different spiritual ambitions is one of the reasons it has never belonged to a single orthodoxy. The Mahabharata has also been a source of artistic inspiration in painting, sculpture, and miniature art. Scenes from the epic, Draupadi's disrobing, the binding of Bhima, the Bhagavad Gita's discourse, appear across royal and sacred spaces, where they function as moral and aesthetic models. Visual representations often crystallize particular interpretive choices, freezing a moment of drama into an image that continues to teach and provoke. In the modern era, the Mahabharata's cultural presence has expanded through print, radio, cinema, and television, reaching audiences far beyond the subcontinent. Adaptations have ranged from faithful retellings to radical reworkings that place the epic in new temporal and spatial contexts. These adaptations often reveal as much about the society producing them as about the ancient text itself. They expose contemporary anxieties, political ideologies, and questions about identity. One of the most influential modern retellings is the televised adaptation that brought the Mahabharata into millions of living rooms, where the serial form allowed viewers to develop intimate and sustained relationships with characters. The serial's choices about pacing and emphasis, what to expand, what to prune, helped shape a common popular memory of the epic. At the same time, critical and artistic retellings in the form of novels, plays, and films have explored marginal voices, reimagined gendered experiences, and questioned heroic narratives. Global scholarship has approached the Mahabharata from many angles: textual criticism, philology, anthropology, literary theory, and comparative mythology, among others. Each method illuminates different features of the epic, from its compositional layers to its social contexts and symbolic resonances. Western philosophers and writers have found in the Mahabharata a reservoir of ethical dilemmas and dramatic intensity that resonates with universal human concerns, making the epic an object of cross-cultural engagement. The legacy of the Mahabharata also consists in the ways it has been used as a mnemonic for political ideas. Leaders and thinkers have evoked its episodes to justify policies, to warn against tyranny, or to rally collective identity. Such political appropriation can be both generative and dangerous. It can breathe new life into the text, but it can also simplify and instrumentalize complex moral teachings for partisan ends. Because the Mahabharata is a source of moral complexity, it has become a tool for pedagogy, used to teach ethics through narrative rather than abstract precepts. Stories of dilemmas, oaths, and broken trusts invite learners to place themselves in the shoes of protagonists and to practice moral reasoning. This educative dimension has made the epic useful in schools, religious instruction, and family storytelling, where it functions as both entertainment and a moral laboratory. The language of the Mahabharata, classical Sanskrit in its canonical form, carries with it layers of poetic convention and rhetorical flourish. Translators face the persistent challenge of rendering not just meaning but texture, and every translation is an interpretive act. Some translations aim for literal fidelity, while others prioritize idiomatic resonance, and the variety of available translations itself testifies to the epic's interpretive richness. Orality and memory imprint particular rhythms on the text. Repetitions, formulaic phrases, and mnemonic devices identify older layers within the narrative and point to its origin in oral performance. These features also make the epic eminently recitable. They create a kind of verbal architecture that supports long-form narration. For listeners, that architecture fosters immersion and gives shape to the vast narrative landscape. There is an aesthetic of rupture in the Mahabharata as well, a sense that great stories include moments of collapse where ordinary rules are suspended. Battles that end in moral catastrophe, kings who fail at critical junctures, and rituals that go awry all contribute to an atmosphere of precariousness. These ruptures demand an ethical imagination capable of facing loss without collapsing into despair, and in that demand the epic serves as a crucible for moral resilience. The Mahabharata's depictions of women are varied and often contradictory, reflecting the complex social positions women occupied. Some women act as political agents and moral arbiters, others are subject to structures that limit their options. Figures like Kunti and Gandhari, as well as Draupadi, become focal points for debates about maternal power, renunciation, and the burdens placed on women by patriarchal systems. The epic's portrayal of ascetics and sages also complicates any simplistic dismissal of religious authority. Sages can be sources of wisdom and guidance, but they can also be self-interested or morally compromised. The Mahabharata examines how spiritual authority intersects with worldly power, and it probes the consequences when renunciants return to the arena of politics and kinship. Many of the law codes and Dharmashastra literature in the South Asian tradition engage directly with the scenarios the Mahabharata presents, treating episodes as precedents for legal reasoning. The epic thus became a point of reference in constructing norms around inheritance, kingship, and interpersonal obligations. In this way, narrative itself becomes part of the legal imagination, shaping how societies reason about justice. The Mahabharata engages with the metaphysical idea of karma and the moral economy that links action to consequence. Yet it also complicates simple karmic calculus by showing how collective decisions, structural inequalities, and human miscommunication can produce suffering in ways that cannot be reduced to individual moral deserts. The result is a layered moral framework that situates personal responsibility within broader social networks. Over time, the Mahabharata entered the spiritual practices of many communities who used its stories as aids for meditation, ritual, and ethical formation. Recitations of the epic could be acts of devotion, and fragments like the Bhagavad Gita became liturgical recitations in many contexts. In performance, the epic's moral dramas were not merely entertainment but part of communal identity and spiritual aspiration. The epic also fosters a robust strain of political philosophy that wrestles with the nature of sovereignty. Questions of legitimate rule, the duties of a ruler, and the moral hazards of power recur in council scenes and royal dialogues. The Mahabharata thus functions as a repository of political exempla, offering models of governance and cautionary tales about the corrosive influence of ambition. The psychology of the Mahabharata is as intricate as its politics. Characters experience jealousy, pride, shame, and grief in forms that feel intimate and immediate, and the narrative pays attention to interior states in ways that anticipate modern psychological subtlety. Tales within the epic probe motives and consequences, and in listening we learn to trace how small slights and private desires can scale into public tragedies. The epic's treatment of fate and free will is one of its most enduring philosophical puzzles. On the one hand, many events seem preordained by curse and destiny. On the other hand, characters repeatedly exercise choice, leading to unique moral responsibility. This dynamic creates a dialectic between inevitability and accountability, inviting listeners to reflect on the degree to which lives are scripted by outside forces versus shaped by conscious action. Because the Mahabharata is not a unified doctrinal manual, it has been fertile ground for philosophical debate. The epic contains Vedantic meditations, Samkhya elements, and devotional currents that sometimes pull in different directions. This pluralism is not a bug but a defining feature. The epic models how multiple philosophical frameworks can coexist and converse within a single cultural space. The Mahabharata's language of oath and vow underscores the centrality of speech acts in the moral economy of the ancient world. Promises, curses, and vows carry weight equal to weapons, and the breaking of an oath has real political and personal consequences. The epic thereby places speech at the heart of ethical life, as a medium that constructs and destroys social reality. Stories of friendship and loyalty, especially the bond between Krishna and Arjuna and between the Pandava brothers themselves, explore the ethical terrain of allegiance. These friendships are tested by ambition and sorrow, and their loyalty is often the very thing that leads to sacrifice. In portraying such bonds, the epic asks whether fidelity to friends comes at the expense of impartial justice, and it leaves the question open. The Mahabharata has inspired reinterpretation through feminist and subaltern readings that foreground those voices traditionally marginalized in the main narrative. Such readings reclaim agency, highlight resistance, and show how lived experience diverges from the formal legal and ritual discourses. They reveal the epic as a contested text, one whose meanings have been and continue to be fought over in the realm of social power. In the arts, the Mahabharata's sayings have been reimagined in dance, music, and theater, with each creative community translating the story through its own aesthetic grammar. Kathakali, Bharatanatyam, Vayam, and other forms have found in the epic a wealth of expressive material, using movement and sound to evoke emotional nuance and narrative momentum. These reworkings are not mere retellings, they are acts of cultural translation that keep the epic alive in new sensibilities. The epic has also been a vehicle for regional identity, with rulers and communities claiming particular episodes as foundational to their histories. Temples and monuments commemorating events from the Mahabharata anchor myth to geography and allow communities to narrate themselves into a grander timeline. Such claims turn story into sight, and sight into memory, binding people to story through landscape. Translations and retellings that place the Mahabharata in contemporary settings have shown its adaptability to modern moral quandaries. When authors recast characters as modern bureaucrats or use the war as a metaphor for ideological conflict, they reveal the epic's capacity to illuminate present-day ethical puzzles. These modern renditions underscore the text's continuing relevance and its uncanny ability to speak to new forms of social life. The Mahabharata's endurance is partly a function of its ability to resist closure. Wars end, but consequences ripple into unexpected places, dialogues close but new questions arise. Listeners and readers are left with more to ponder than simple resolution can provide. And that sense of unfinished business ensures that the epic remains a perennial conversation partner rather than a concluded statement. Even the epic's treatment of death deserves sustained attention. The narrative dwells on mortality not as an abstract truth, but as an event that rearranges obligations and reshapes kinship. Funerary rites, mourning, and the ethical tasks left to survivors are portrayed with a specificity that anchors metaphysical speculation in the practices of the everyday. Death in the Mahabharata is therefore both an existential endpoint and a social hinge. Intergenerational responsibility is another major theme. Decisions made by parents and grandparents reverberate, for good and ill, across generations. The epic insists that lineage is not merely biological but ethical, that past actions create moral debts that descendants must reckon with. This long view of history complicates any short-term calculus of power and encourages listeners to think about legacy as a moral category. Curses and blessings function in the Mahabharata as narrative engines that convert private speech into public fate. A single utterance by a wronged figure can alter the path of a kingdom, and the epic uses these moments to dramatize the potency of speech. The device of curse and blessing also binds personal slights to cosmic consequences, reinforcing the interconnectedness of moral acts and historical outcomes. The narrative voice of the Mahabharata is richly reflexive. It often comments on its own storytelling and includes meta-narratives about who tells the story and why. This self-awareness invites audiences to question sources, to consider the authority of narrative, and to think about how stories are mobilized in the service of identity. The epic thereby cultivates a listenerly skepticism as well as an appetite for myth. Certain episodes, like Yakshau's questions to Yudhishthira or the game of dice that precipitates exile, are microcosms of the epic's moral laboratory. They condense major ethical problems into compact scenes where choice and consequence are immediately visible. Listeners familiar with these moments find in them thematic keys that unlock broader patterns across the text. The Mahabharata's approach to kingship includes both ceremonial grandeur and bureaucratic detail, describing not just the pomp of the throne but also the management of grain, law, and taxation. This attention to economic and administrative life demonstrates the epic's interest in the practical mechanisms that sustain polities. Political morality, the epic suggests, depends as much on good governance as on heroic virtue. The text's subtle treatment of irony is another hallmark. Heroes speak noble words that undercut their actions, and wise men deliver counsel that proves to be tragically limited. This layered irony deepens characterization and resists didactic simplification, inviting listeners to experience the messy realities of moral life. The Mahabharata also offers a taxonomy of power: the brute force of warriors, the persuasive power of speech, the spiritual authority of sages, and the institutional power of kings and courts. Each form of power has its own logic and vulnerabilities, and the epic explores how they compete and collude. Power is never straightforwardly good. It can be exercised with justice or abused with devastating results. Pilgrimage and sacred geography are woven through the epic, with rivers, hills, and cities serving as nodes where moral narratives unfold. These places become invested with sacred memory, and pilgrimage to them is both a physical and spiritual journey that reenacts the epic's moral landscape. By mapping story onto place, the Mahabharata turns geography into a canvas for ethical engagement. The role of prophecy and seer speech is ambivalent in the epic. Prophets foretell outcomes but often lack the moral authority to change them. Prophecies can be used to justify action or to explain failure, and the text plays with their ambiguity to blur the line between foreknowledge and fatalism. This interplay forces listeners to consider how predictions shape behavior and whether knowledge of the future alters moral choice. Networks of obligation in the Mahabharata, between patron and client, ruler and subject, friend and friend, function as the social scaffolding that holds the world together. When these networks fray, the social fabric unravels and violence becomes more likely. Thus, much of the epic is an extended study of how social bonds are formed, maintained, and broken. The Mahabharata's literary craft is evident in its pacing: long stretches of deliberation alternate with episodes of sudden action. This tempo allows for deep psychological probing and then releases tension through decisive events, creating an aesthetic rhythm that engages and unsettles. Such narrative design supports the epic's capacity for sustained moral reflection while maintaining dramatic propulsion. The epic's exploration of exile and return is resonant across cultures because it captures a human pattern: separation, transformation, and reintegration. Exile in the Mahabharata is both a punishment and a schooling, a period in which characters confront inner truth and emerge altered. The return, often violent and ambiguous, reveals how exile changes the social calculus. The story's many duels and moral debates function as rituals of recognition. Combat tests character and speech seeks to align intention with outcome. These contests are not merely entertainment, they enact public evaluations of worth and lay bare the consequences of pride and folly. In this way, the epic makes adjudication a dramatic and ethical process. Over time, commentators and storytellers have used the Mahabharata to model idealized kingship but also to satirize rulers who fall short. The epic's ambivalent portraits of rulers provide both exemplars and warnings, enabling a broad discourse on the ethics of leadership that is still cited in political thought. Its long shadow thus extends into contemporary discussions of governance and responsibility. The Mahabharata mediates tensions between local custom and universal principle, showing how rituals and laws can vary while still pointing toward shared moral aims. This interplay has allowed the epic to be authoritative without being monolithic, creating a textual space in which diversity of practice coexists with ethical aspiration. Listeners drawn to the epic find in it a multiplicity that reflects the pluralistic societies from which it emerged. Among the epic's most poignant features is its account of grief and penitence. Characters who survive great violence are left with spiritual and emotional wounds that rituals cannot fully heal, and their attempts at atonement involve both public penance and inward reflection. This honest depiction of sorrow deepens the narrative and invites audiences to recognize the cost of victory. The Mahabharata's moral dilemmas often force choices between competing goods: duty to family versus duty to society, truth versus expediency, honor versus mercy. These conflicts ensure that the epic does not support a single moral doctrine but instead becomes a training ground for ethical imagination. In confronting such dilemmas, listeners practice the difficult art of prioritization under moral uncertainty. Canons of narrative authority in the epic include not only its opening narrator but a host of embedded voices that testify to the story's truth. This multiplicity of testimony creates a communal sense of validation. Truth is not declared by a single voice but confirmed through many accounts. Such narrative structure models a democratic sense of truth-seeking that values multiple perspectives. The Mahabharata's endurance in folk traditions is remarkable. From village storytellers to temple festivals, its episodes have been dramatized and reinterpreted, often acquiring local inflections that make the stories relevant to particular communities. These popular forms of engagement ensure that the epic remains not a museum piece but a living text, practiced and felt in everyday life. Language reformulations of the epic in colonial and post-colonial contexts have also been significant. Colonial writers often treated the Mahabharata as an anthropological curiosity or a source of moral instruction. Post-colonial authors have reclaimed it as a site of cultural sovereignty and critique. These shifting appropriations reveal how empires and nations engage with foundational myths to build identities and justify narratives of modernity. The Mahabharata has been mined by psychologists, political theorists, and ethicists seeking concrete cases for abstract arguments. Its narratives provide richly detailed instances of human behavior that can be analyzed for motive, structure, and consequence. Academics and practitioners alike find in its episodes a kind of natural laboratory for testing ideas about moral psychology and institutional design. Throughout its history, the epic has sparked controversy as often as veneration. Debates about textual authenticity, orthodoxy, and the propriety of certain episodes reflect the contested nature of any foundational narrative. These disputes are a sign of vitality rather than decay. They indicate that the Mahabharata continues to be interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation. The Mahabharata's metaphors, battle as moral testing, the throne as a burden, exile as a school, have penetrated cultural expression in ways that go beyond direct retelling. Poets, orators, and artists invoke its imagery to create resonance with audiences familiar with its codes. This intertextual presence keeps the epic at the center of cultural conversation. One of the most distinctive legacies of the Mahabharata is its insistence that ethical life requires constant negotiation. There are no final answers because the world continues to change and new situations arise that demand renewed judgment. The epic's refusal to close debate is both a literary strategy and a moral posture, encouraging humility and continuing reflection. The epic has been central to debates about women's rights and patriarchy, with modern readers using it to critique inherited social norms and to highlight stories of resistance. Feminist retellings have given voice to characters whose interior lives were traditionally silent or sidelined, and these retellings have helped reanimate discussions about gender and power. In doing so, they reveal how the epic can be both conservative and subversive. Pilgrimages, rituals, and commemorations that connect communities to Mahabharata events continue to renew the story's social life. These practices translate narrative into embodied action, marking the physical world with memories and meanings. Through ritual, the epic's lessons are enacted, reified, and sometimes contested, yielding a cultural memory that is enacted as much as narrated. Poets and novelists have long mined the epic for human stories, recasting episodes in modern idioms and exploring psychological interiority with new freedom. These literary transformations often focus on marginal figures, reimagining their motives and exploring the power dynamics hidden in the canonical text. Such works demonstrate how the Mahabharata can be both an archaeological site of culture and a living source of renewed artistic energy. The Mahabharata's moral imagination extends even to ecological themes, with its descriptions of land, resource disputes, and seasonal cycles reflecting an embedded environmental sensibility. Stories about drought, famine, and the care of cattle and crops remind listeners that political choices have ecological consequences. These concerns make the epic relevant to contemporary discussions about sustainability and stewardship. The epic's rhetorical strategies, dialogue, monologue, counsel scenes, and didactic interludes create a polyvalent discourse that accommodates both narrative drive and philosophical reflection. This hybrid form allows it to function as epic, scripture, and handbook at different moments, depending on how it is read or performed. Such formal flexibility is a key to its long-term cultural adaptability. The Mahabharata's account of friendship, betrayal, ambition, sacrifice, and remorse resonates because it mirrors the human condition with honesty and complexity. Its characters are neither saints nor villains but flawed persons whose choices illuminate our own. The epic thus serves as a communal mirror, a story through which societies examine their values and their failures. As the Mahabharata has traveled beyond its original linguistic and cultural borders, it has been translated and adapted in ways that highlight universal themes while also refracting local concerns. Comparative studies have shown its echoes in other epic traditions, revealing shared structures in how human communities tell stories about conflict, fate, and duty. These global resonances underscore the Mahabharata's place in world literature as a text that speaks to core human dilemmas. In classrooms and lecture halls, the Mahabharata is taught not as a remote relic but as a living text that can illuminate contemporary moral and political problems. Students encounter it as a narrative that demands interpretation and ethical imagination, and its episodes often become the basis for discussion about leadership, justice, and responsibility. Pedagogically, the epic is prized for its capacity to nurture critical thinking and empathy. The story's engagement with lamentation and penitence figures into its final acts, where survivors reckon with the cost of conflict and the moral landscape is left marred. The concluding episodes are often subdued, emphasizing repair and the difficulty of restoring what was lost. These endings are not triumphant so much as catechetical, teaching the listener about the limits of victory and the possibilities of atonement. Archaeological interest in places associated with the Mahabharata has blurred lines between myth and historical inquiry, with excavations and local traditions sometimes converging to create contested claims about the past. Whether or not one finds direct historical evidence for the epic's events, the material culture associated with its stories continues to shape collective memory. This interplay between materiality and myth proves the story's deep embedding in the physical world. The Mahabharata's influence on legal thought in South Asia has been enduring, with jurists and thinkers drawing on its exempla when fashioning notions of justice and retributive practice. Its complex moral scenes offer case studies that help refine the application of law to human behavior, and its authority has been invoked in courts and councils over centuries. This juridical afterlife of the epic is a testament to its practical engagement with questions of right action. Across time, the Mahabharata has persisted because it offers both intimate human stories and grand cosmic vistas, and it allows each generation to read itself into the fabric of myth. Its adaptability, polyphony, and moral complexity ensure that it cannot be reduced to a single lesson or dogma. To listen to the Mahabharata is to enter an ongoing conversation about what it means to be human, responsible, and fallible in a world of conflicting claims. Don't stay outside the myth. Subscribe immediately to join the ongoing conversation, and comment the lesson you see reflected from your world in this epic.